At 7, I found myself in front of an old house in the old part of the old town of Sky Gray. The clapboard was painted white. The window panes were wavy with age. There was a bay window in front, beside a porch with room for a swing. The house was 2 stories and had a red tin roof. I knocked. A heavy-set man about 55 answered the door. He wore a short-sleeved khaki shirt that looked as if it were fresh, clean blue work pants with a Dickies tag on one leg, and running shoes. Although he was so big, he probably didn't run long distances. "John?" he asked. "Yes, sir. I'm here to see Maria." Come in," and he held the door open. "I am Tom Gray." I held up my bandaged hand to explain why we should shake left-handed. "Hurt my hand," I said. The air conditioning was a great relief from the humid, August heat. He pointed me to a chair in the living room. "Sally," he called, "John's here." Sally came in then, tiny like her daughter, with similar red hair and pale complexion. "John, nice to meet you. I did not get your last name." "Buck, John Buck." I shook her hand, my left to her right when she saw my bandage laid, but she did not let go for some seconds, as if the meeting were more significant than most. "We're glad to meet you, John. Come in and sit. Would you like something to drink? Soft drink? Water?" she asked. We sat then as we waited. No. We probably need to get going soon." As all of Sky Gray, the Gray house had a lived-in feel to it. Older furniture that could use recovering or replacement, mix-match chairs at the kitchen table, that sort of lived in. "So, what do you do, John?" Tom asked. He seemed very interested, as if he didn't see many dates for Maria, and he wanted to be sure to ask the right things of me. "I work at God's Abode Hospital. I'm an administrator. I organize meetings for doctors and arrange lectures, help keep everyone licensed, that sort of thing," I said. Tom nodded and then asked, "How'd you hurt your hand?" "In the shooting 2 months ago," I said. Tom perked up at that, and Sally also. "Oh, you were involved in that?" Sally asked. "Some. We're not supposed to say too much, to protect some people who might be targeted for revenge, that sort of thing," I said. I was becoming more adept at deflecting people from their real interest. "Well, I just want to be sure that Maria is in good hands," Tom said, trying to be polite. "If you are concerned, I can." I started, but I was interrupted. From behind me I heard, rather forcefully, "Don't you dare think of leaving, Maria." I stood and turned. She wore a blue sundress that left her arms bare and even showed a little cleavage. Her red hair reached her shoulders and was combed back from her eyes. Her statement was out of character, based on the shyness that had characterized her at the church. Maybe she was more at ease in her own home. She was smiling. I wasn't. "You're beautiful, Maria," I said, staring and knowing I shouldn't. "Yes, you are," said her mother. We watched her a moment. "I made reservations," I said. "We should be going. I'd love to talk to you all, though. Maybe when we return." Tom said, "I look forward to it." I said, "We are just going to dinner outside of town and we shouldn't be late. We only met today." "Oh, and if you're worried, you might want to call Father Phil. He knows me pretty well. I've been living in your rectory since late June." Sally said, "You're the one?" It was announced at Mass that he'd taken on a roomer since the house was so big, but he didn't say a name. "Of course, son," Tom said, standing beside Sally now. "Take care of our girl." Sally looked at Maria. "You have your phone? The panic numbers?" Maria nodded and looked away. "Have a good time then," Sally said, Tom nodding. He looked at me, and I at him. It was a serious and dense look. He loved Maria. We left. I found out what those numbers were during our dinner. We went to an Italian chain restaurant that was not too fancy. Finding the restaurant was no problem. It was down the street from the rectory, but way out in the country, near Greenville. Our table was ready on time, even on a crowded Friday evening. We talked about her, and why the priest had gotten us together. She said that after the attack 8 years ago, she went into a severe depression, developed a fear of going outside her home, and could not even talk on the phone. Years of counseling followed, with pills for anxiety and depression. She had never been suicidal, but she cloistered herself in the home. Finally, after about 3 years of once-per-week therapy, she started to run. She had been a runner in high school and a pretty good one at that. At first, she'd get her mother or father to follow on a bike or in a car. After some time, they said no and she started to run on her own. Always in open, populated areas during broad daylight. Then someone found her a job at the motel 2 years ago. And now she went out about once a week to a store or mall, usually with her mother, but occasionally someone would drop her off and pick her up. She went to church on her own, usually walking the 3 blocks. She still went to therapy weekly. "So you know why Father introduced me to you," she said. "Now why did he introduce you to me?" Fair enough. I had more trouble talking about my marriage than I did the terrorist attack. I was married until this week. After the hospital attack, my wife confessed that she had a 3-year-long affair with one of the victims. She thought he would take care of her in his will. She told me she had never really loved me. Anyway, it turns out neither of our children. Here I had to stop because my voice faltered, and Maria put her right hand on my left on the table as I looked off. I looked then at her hand, pale and small with slim fingers and now on mine. My voice was only a whisper as I said, neither one was mine. Biologically, they are 2 years and the baby 4 months old. I paused, steadied, and continued a bit louder. She sued for divorce. I didn't have the means to fight for custody of children who were not biologically mine, and her lawyer notified us that she would allege I was abusive if I did not agree to terms. Ultimately, my wife got what she wanted, though she thought she'd have money from the guy's estate. He left her nothing, but the kids each got quite a bit. She will have trouble making ends meet unless she uses their money, or maybe gets a summer job, that sort of thing. Or remarries soon. She's a teacher. I pay no alimony or child support. I was quiet then, upset but without tears. Do you love the kids? Yes, I said, anguish wrenching my face, my voice lowering, softening. But I'm not sure that's healthy anymore. Dylan, the older boy, and Hanley, the girl. Their father was a surgeon at my hospital. The guy was playing around with several women and had a wife and 2 kids in New England. My wife didn't know about any of that. Almost 3 years long was their affair. She was so cruel when she told me. She didn't realize he'd been stringing her along. The kids probably won't remember me much longer, if Hanley ever did know me. I don't know what's best for them. Should I say I considered stealing them away in the night? Running off to darkest Africa, or deepest Amazon, or maybe Tallahassee? Silence pervaded then, and we looked at each other. She spoke first. You know I'm not. I'm not after a quick relationship, John. Its failure would be difficult, and I wouldn't want one. I hesitated. We'll just let it progress as seems best. No pressures, no forcing anything. We sipped some wine and didn't worry if there were some short silences. I held her hand as we walked up to her front door. She said, I'd kiss you goodnight, but I'm sure Mom and Dad want to talk to you. Then kiss me for now. She did. Thin little girls can have soft lips, and their arms can be surprisingly strong. Or maybe it's just redheads. For once, I was tall, and I liked it. I recounted the shooting in very general terms to her parents as we sipped on beer, and the moon came up outside. I said I shot my hand by accident, and they decided to smile at that, but it didn't seem silly. I sat in one of the overstuffed wood and upholstery chairs that I think were originally from this end up, and after a few minutes Maria came and sat on the arm of it with an arm around me. I finished the story. The end result is I've slightly crippled myself, but about that moment the thing ended, I said. Tom's doubt was not assuaged. You're right-handed? I nodded. I canted my head at him. So how'd? He knew, I think. He had seen that video and seen me using my left hand to fire. Perhaps he'd noticed the blurry fling of my right hand as the bullet struck it. I looked at him and saw him make an effort not to comment, keeping his thoughts to himself. He looked back. I thought I saw a small nod. I spoke, filling the gap he would have. It was after 11, and that was late enough for a dinner date the same day I met someone. Mr. Gray, Mrs. Gray, I understand Maria is descended from the original founders of the town. I look forward to hearing that story very much. I'm leaving now. I hope you have no objection to me seeing Maria. If she would like to see me, Maria, I'll be in touch. Very soon, I said, smiling. She walked me to the door and closed it behind me. Early August can be very hot in Ohio, and even in the evening, the heat can hit you like a wall. By the time I reached my car, I was covered with perspiration. It was a lesson. All relationships face a wall sooner or later. We met in the morning, talked each of our mental neuroses, and kissed. That was enough for one day. I had lost Karen and Dylan and Hanley. Nothing was for sure. I needed something human, something emotional, to be strong, perhaps for it to endure. So began the easygoing part of the courtship of Maria Gray. I let days pass. I called her, and we talked for a few minutes on Sunday. I noticed her running Tuesday late afternoon. I called her parents Wednesday to ask if she would mind my picking her up at work when she was finished, just to give her a ride and have a chance to talk to her. Her mom thought it would be a nice gesture, but she might be a little put out because she'd be grimy from her work. I'll bet she makes even grimy look beautiful, I said. Her mom said to go ahead, her voice sounding happy at my words, and she told me where to park so I would not miss her. I arrived a few minutes early and leaned against my car so she'd see me. At 3:35, she came out with another woman, laughing, and then saw me and stopped. Her hand went to her hair, and her friend saw her hesitate and look at me. Maria smiled and shook her head. She said something to her friend, grabbed her by the hand, and pulled her toward me. "Hello, I thought I'd give you a ride home," I said as they approached. "Do you have room for Eva?" "Eva, this is John Buck. John, this is Eva Dominguez Lopez Velardo," or something like that, she said laughingly. I held out my left hand to Eva, who must have been 40 or so. "Glad to meet you, Eva," I said. She said, "So you're the guy Maria's been talking about." "I'm glad to hear that. Get on in, ladies, and I'll need directions." There was a lot of laughter from those two, and I saw a forthrightness and openness in Maria that indicated a less diffident side to her personality, like her insistence at her house. They spoke of work and the odd things that happened, their boss's sarcasm, their parents, the church, and Eva's kids. Everything was cause for humor with Eva, and it made Maria's eyes brighten and her voice lilt. There was a deep-seated fragility to Maria, as if she were on the verge of a precipice and it would not take much to push her past stability. She talked very, very quietly, especially at the beginning of conversation. She apparently dealt with an urge to withdrawal every day. She would just rather not. Not work, not eat, not dress, not move, not turn on the TV, not read, not clean, not play. Not. It was the getting started that was so hard. It took me some discussions with her and her mother to understand. A terrible experience had changed her forever. 1. So I tried to see her every other day or so that she could count on me but didn't feel pressured. I would show up, after that first time, to drive her home, or I would wave to her as she ran past a usual jogging spot, or I'd just call her on the phone. This went on for some time, and as it passed, I'd stop in to visit unannounced. Her mother was always glad to see me, I think, or call and meet her at the ice cream shop or Starbucks. We went to 2 Dayton Dragons baseball games as their season wound down. I took her to a show in Cincinnati, but on a Sunday afternoon, so we weren't in the city after dark. She asked me to a wedding and reception of one of her cousins. We danced. Once again, I discovered what a wonderful thing it was to hold a woman's body in my arms, small and thin, lithe, as hers was. I reacted to her as a man does to a woman, and I think it surprised her. She hesitated just a moment in her breathing, feeling me. Over those first 2 months, August and September, she introduced me to aunts, uncles, cousins, even an old high school boyfriend. I found myself jealous despite 12 years, and that he was married with a child. It was almost 3 months after the hospital attack that Homeland Security agents arrested all known members of the Middle Eastern World Caliphate in the United States. 14 total were arrested in Minneapolis, Los Angeles, Detroit, and a farm about 30 miles south of Fort Wayne, Indiana. It was at the farm that they hid weapons, explosives, and equipment, assuming it was less likely to be noticed in the countryside. Perhaps it had been. Homeland Security acted when it did because there was evidence that another attack was soon to take place, although the exact time and place were not divulged. Nor was the successful method used for investigation. It turned out that a third, glorious, suicidal attack was planned for the holiday season, but no details or targets were disclosed. It was always a small and radical group, mainly Middle Eastern but with ambition to bring terror to America. Its leader was Ahil Ali, a relatively minor cleric with some conception of a ruthless and evil ideology. Ali was determined to shoot it out with the federal agents who came for him in Minneapolis, but when he ran out of ammunition, he was knocked unconscious and captured. 2 fought to the death at the farm, but the rest were captured in the middle of the night, still abed. The federal agents were fairly confident they had the group fully contained. The other half of it remained in known locations in the Middle East, but were well identified. It was a very serious group. I received a call from Remark the day after the arrests around the country. "Mr. Buck, this is Special Agent Remark." "Yes, don't you ever get tired of saying Special Agent all the time? I should think you'd have to explain what makes you special." "Yeah," he laughed, "but I'm not allowed to say just agent or officer or anything. It's a rule. I have some good news. You should be seeing it on the TV. We think we've arrested all the members of that terror outfits that shot up your hospital. The ones in the country, anyway. We'll be discussing your anonymity at a meeting tomorrow, but it is likely to be lifted. There is probably no more danger for you than anyone else. I'll give you a call after the meeting to let you know what's decided." "Good. Although I like the anonymity. That is good news all around. You guys have been doing a lot of work, it sounds like." "Yes, very true. I haven't slept a full night in 2 months." He was quiet then for a moment before going on. "Hey, did you ever tell your wife that you shot them?" "No. She divorced me a week after the shooting. Thanks for calling, and please call with either decision after the meeting. I'd like to know either way. And get some sleep." "Sure thing, Mr. Buck. Mr. Buck? He asked. Yeah, I answered. Astounding, really, what you did. You protected the hostages and eliminated the threat in a few seconds. We enhanced a video that showed it, but we couldn't get the audio right. What did you yell? And then you said something like, I think it was that old Marine yell, Ora, or something. But after I said, you messed with the wrong Marine, I was smiling. Heard it in a movie. I was all fired up. Sounds like it. The guys have been laughing about it. Nothing original. Thanks, Eric. Tomorrow. Click. The next day, Remark called around 10 a.m. and said all records regarding God's abode, with the exception of a classified file that contained information about Homeland Security techniques, would be opened immediately. I thanked him. I appreciated all of the effort that must have gone into those arrests, and I liked the confidence that they had arrested everyone dangerous. I wondered how they could know. I assumed they were as sure as anyone could be. It turned out they had only missed one. He was hiding and scared and not far away. He was probably very worried that he would be next. Eventually, I spoke to Remark, and in general, he explained the fastidious methods that over time built their case. They were tedious and painstaking and thorough. They had used techniques that would identify cells, building diagrams from person to person, much like teachers used sociograms to create groups in classrooms. Web diagrams covered walls as different links were checked, and some whole diagrams identified as possibly radical and others dismissed as false leads. The investigative techniques were becoming tried and had proven true with few radical terror overlooked in many other probes. Agents and analysts were meticulous in their use of the technique. No contact was to be missed. Running down every contact, from a clerk at a convenience store to the friend of a friend, was also exhausting. Decisions had to be made day and night. Perhaps it was the exhaustion of day and night investigation, but that one sympathizer of the IWC remained unknown, at large, and vengeful. There was only one email by any member of the IWC that referred to him, and that was cryptic. It was eventually overlooked for the thousands of others. It was not clear even when examined. It was one word, an answer to a question. Ahil Ali asked Yusef Talib if he had a resource, and the answer was yes. A Homeland Security analyst interpreted the resource as money, as it often was, and assumed the natural Arabic speakers, using English to avoid language detection on the net, had misspelled yes. Terror made such errors frequently, but this resource was a person, not money. The resource was untrained, young, and alone. How he communicated with the cell was not divulged. Once Homeland Security figured it out. Yassine was Yusef's younger brother. He was not in Ohio, but Sky Gray was only an hour and a half from Indianapolis. Yass was distraught when his brother died for so small a death toll in Sky Gray, and then when all his fellows were rounded up in one fell swoop, he went silent. He continued working at the motel where he was a night clerk, but he no longer had the money for college. He knew to hide, but he didn't know what would become of him. He assumed the U.S. government was looking for him, so he slept with his brother's pistol beside his bed. He had a false ID, a passport, but his student's visa was expired. It was a serious mistake by Homeland, but an honest one. Yassine was almost unknown even to the IWC. When he did not communicate with his IWC contact in Saudi, the contact assumed he was also captured or dead. Yassine hid for 15 months, eventually contacting friends and relatives in the Middle East over the internet. He was very circumspect when he did. Bill Meyer and Randy Winger were the guards who confronted the killers in the cafeteria that awful morning. I found them down the hall, near their usual post, right after I hung up with Remark. I told them the files were being opened, and we discussed the loss of anonymity. They were willing to refuse to divulge my name, per my wishes. I did not think that was necessary any longer since the police reports would be open with my name for all to see. I just asked them to be honest and not to embellish anything. I thought that they had stopped the killings by confronting the bad guys. I would say so if asked, but I intended to avoid interviews because I didn't think any good came of them. I wondered if I would be known for that one desperate act. I wondered if I wanted to be known. I realized that much of my life I had hidden behind a non-religious belief in humility as a virtue. It allowed me to be shy, to avoid rancor or serious disagreement. I could avoid most confrontation, but also much conviction. I was not known as a Republican or Democrat, a liberal or conservative, a religious or atheist believer. I was just a nice guy who looked away rather than argue, or oppose a forceful individual. Perhaps I'd joined the Marines because I realized that flaw in my character, hoping they would help me overcome it. I went home to Mom and Dad. We sat at the table and talked about that day. I explained exactly what happened, what I did, how I shot my hand, and they seemed proud in Mom's case and astounded in Dad's. As I talked on, he got quiet, stood up next to me, and put his hand on my shoulder. I had never been so touched by a gesture of his. He said, "They will go after Karen and the news people. You must tell her." All of a sudden, the divorce might become fodder for gossip. He was right. I had had no contact with her since before the divorce. I wondered what she would say. I called, and her cell phone sent me the message. I left. "Karen Ann, I need to speak with you immediately about the shooting at the hospital. Please call me right away." She was probably in class. The new school year was underway. There were many people I felt needed to know the truth before the media. I left Mom and Dad and drove to Maria's parents' house. I knocked on their door, and Mrs. Gray answered. "John, I did not expect it to be you. Come in, please," she said. "I need to talk to you about something, ma'am," I said. "It's important. Nothing bad, it's just it needs to be now." I stepped inside. "Of course," she said, a bit put out. "I'm alone here. Maria's at work. Tom is not here. What is it?" She seemed worried and concerned. "It may not mean anything to you, but the files on the shooting at the hospital are going to be opened today. The group that attacked the hospital, most have been arrested in America. You should know because, well, I didn't tell you everything. I shot the two killers. I shot my hand too, but I shot both those guys." She looked at me, relieved that it was nothing about Maria, no evil that was being done, but still the news confounded her. "Tom said," she began, "you shot yourself in the right hand and you are right-handed. He said, Sal." He wasn't telling us everything. Something else went on. She paused. "Now I know. I think there is liable to be a news frenzy," I said. "Soon, they'll have my name, maybe my picture." I waited for her mind to make connections. "It's possible they will find out that Maria's my girlfriend." She looked at me, smiling and thinking about that. "You have no idea how good that sounds. Maria has had so many trials and obstacles. Your girlfriend." I smiled with her. "I think you might want to let Tom know, before he hears it somewhere else. I doubt news people come after him, but I wanted to let you guys and my parents know. My ex-wife. You all might want to keep a low profile," I said. "Should I go tell Maria at work?" Mrs. Gray pondered a bit. I came to know it as part of her nature to pause. She was a very smart lady and nothing seemed to surprise her. Nothing made her act rashly. I waited, and she finally spoke. "I think that would be wise, especially if there might be reporters looking for your friends. Do you really think they'd be interested in her? Or for that matter, how would they know you two have dated? Anyone might have seen us. I don't think they'd go after her, but they might follow her to find me. I'm pretty well hidden at the rectory. It shouldn't be a big deal, and I'm just going to say no comment. I don't know if they'll care. Maybe nothing will happen, I hope. I don't want any of the people close to me to feel slighted that I didn't tell them first." She said, "I'll call Tom right away, and you go find Maria and tell her. If you can't find her, call her cell." I started to go out the door. "Oh, John," she said, following me. I looked at her right behind me. She put her hand on my arm, stood on tiptoes and kissed my cheek. "I'm proud of you." "Wow," I said, "almost as good as Maria's." "I'll see you, ma'am." She smiled as I headed to my car. I found Maria at her work eating lunch in a small utility room that the workers used for eating, storing coats, and things of that nature. I was directed there by the desk clerk. She said, "Just knock and go on in. We don't like to keep the door open with the heat." I knocked and went in, and there she was, sitting with Eva and eating yogurt. There were two other maids sitting at the table. Eva saw me first. "John, I didn't expect you to walk in." Maria turned and stood up, came over and kissed me on the cheek. "Well, I'm getting kisses from all the Gray women today," I said. She turned to the others. "Margie, Tony, this is John Buck." "John, that's Marge and that's Tony. Pleased to meet you. Maria, I need to talk to you in private. Just for a minute." "Okay, let's go outside and sit under the elm." It was hot outside, but the shade was good. There was a picnic table. She had a worried look on her face. Maria, the files on the shooting at the hospital are being released today. When I told you and your parents about the shooting, I told you the truth, but I didn't say everything. Now everyone will know. I shot the two terrorists. I was the one who actually killed them while they held two people hostage. I'm only telling you because I think people will look for me, and they might find you, or try to interview you. News people. Maria just looked at me across the table. "How'd your hand get hurt?" "Dad didn't understand how you got shot in the right hand when you were right-handed. I used my left to fire. I shot the one guy and the bullet went through and hit my hand. I was holding his right hand up, so he didn't fire his pistol into a lady's head. I looked down, and then right into those gray eyes." She looked back for a few seconds. "You saved a lot of people," she said. I said nothing. We just sat for about 3 minutes. I should get back to work, she said, standing up. I walked with her back toward the door when she suddenly turned and hugged me, her cheek against my chest. You should go, she said after a moment, her voice a little shaky. I touched her cheek, using my bandaged hand, and I left. I visited the elementary school, which had opened a new fall quarter a week earlier. I stopped at the front desk. Mrs. Percival, I'm John Buck, Karen Ann's ex-husband, I said to the secretary. I knew her name because Karen and had talked so much of how important it was to keep the school secretary friendly. Yes, Mr. Buck, how may I help you? I've tried to reach Karen and today on her cell phone about a matter that is not an emergency but certainly may affect her. But she is not picking up. Is she in class now? It should only take a minute or two, 5 at the most. She pulled out a stapled sheaf of papers, found Karen Ann's schedule and said, she has about 5 more minutes of lunch. I believe she's in the lounge. Go right on down the hall, and to the right there is a sign. Thank you very much. Karen Ann was in there, sitting with 3 others and laughing. My heart sort of squeezed in my chest at the sight of her. Always smart, always attractive. John, she said, surprised to see me. Excuse me, guys. My ex-husband. John, what is it? She didn't seem angry, miffed, or anything but nice. One of the other teachers was a man about 10 years older, and I thought he was perturbed I'd interrupted. He looked at my bandaged hand and smirked. Terry Marks was there. She nodded, stood and left without a smile. I need a minute. Is it okay if we talk here? I asked. She nodded. Those dark eyes. No wonder Dunstan went after her. Some police files are going to be opened. My name will be out there. There could be some reporters who want to interview you. Me? Why me? Because I'm the guy who killed the terrorists. She looked surprised, but then she smiled mockingly. She was fitting me into her conception of me. Some prejudices are hidden, some are worn on a sleeve. She shook her head. Sure you did. I looked at her with my head cocked to the side and said, I thought you should be aware, because with the files open, everyone will know. I was a great disappointment to you, but I was never a liar. Sorry to bother you. Take care of the kids. I turned to go to the door. As I went out, I heard her laugh and say, he has delusions of. It occurred to me that if I'd become famous before the divorce, maybe she would have loved me. I went back to work. As the day wound down and quitting time approached, Father Michaels called my office. John, could you stop in my office before you go? Yes, sir, I said. I gathered some printouts of notes he'd wanted summarized for a meeting and headed up to his office. I knocked, and his secretary, Kathy, said, Go right in, Mr. Buck. I entered and Father was on the phone. He continued, but waved me to his seat. He hung up. Okay, you have those notes? He asked. I handed them over, and he put them aside. Good. Now, you have been approved for the program in Cleveland, starting in a few weeks. You are enrolled. Unless Kathy is lying to me? I heard through the closed door, I did not lie, from Kathy, his secretary. Papers will be here soon by fax to prove it. Father laughed. He and Kathy had a long relationship. He had baptized her children and was invited to her family gatherings if he couldn't visit his own. She also had complete authority to listen in on his conversations by the speaker system when the door was shut. He had complete trust in her, and I never heard that she ever gossiped. I also heard she was the highest paid secretary in the hospital. Now, your name is being bandied about in the news for the shooting. They have a picture of you from the Marines and a more recent one walking along a hallway here. I think it's from our yearbook. Good picture, by the way. You are on national and local news, right, Kath? She stood in the doorway. Yes, he is. I'm getting requests for interviews on national news, Fox earlier, MSNBC just a second ago. One news talk show is offering $10,000 for the first interview. I shook my head and smiled. I am sorry, Father. I didn't intend to do any interviews. That was the worst day of my life. I lost my marriage, my kids, people died all over. I can't forget that guy's head. I stopped and just shook my head. John, counseling is here. I think you should go, he said. I didn't want to go. I regretted that later when I had some experience with counseling. It would have been better to go, but it seemed like a burden to go to someone to unburden. Perhaps that was part of PTSD, sucking it up, handling it yourself, toughing it out, and allowing the suffering to percolate. He went on. Your program starts in some weeks, and then the position, if it goes to you, which I expect it will once the board gets its heads together. After that, I have another idea to further improve your qualifications. A paid sabbatical after the program was up and running, a year and a half away, for you to attend a master's program in Minneapolis during summer and work independently from home for the final 2/3. There may be other programs that we can work with better. Maybe the new one Ohio State is starting up, so we'll talk. I know a guy at UC who might be willing to work you as a special case. So the Cleveland program was the first, then the job, then hiring assistants, then a sabbatical or online program for a master's. Had he mapped out my future? He went on. Get things prepared as best you can. If the papers ever get here, they'll be here in a minute. Came from Kathy. Look them over. Find the thing online. We need you ready. I'm sorry the board has not yet approved you, but I don't want anyone else in the job. I told them I would not interview anyone else until they gave you a thumbs up or down. They'll probably not decide on you until December, by the way. So sorry, they put things off when they don't like my attitude, he said, laughing. I'd never considered that someone might risk his own job to get me one. Kathy said with mock surprise, oh, a fax just came in. Why? It's the Cleveland program information and it's for John Buck. Father said, take those, go on home, and say hi to Phil. Tell him I'll be there Sunday night. Reporters from local news were on the front sidewalk as I left for the day. I went out the back and made my way to the parking lot. They didn't know my car yet, so I was able to get away. I went to Maria's house for dinner Saturday evening. They had not been bothered by reporters yet, and I hoped they wouldn't be. I didn't know how Maria would take the stress of questions and cameras and news. Tom and I talked about the shooting, and I explained exactly how it happened for me. I was sure Tom had deduced it was me from the video, the way I was wounded, and my circumspection, but he didn't presume to say anything to anyone. It was part of his character, stolid and tactful. Now he could ask and comment. When Sally came in, I also explained about Karen and Dunstan, the children, and the way Father Michaels was working to create a new job for me. Maria sat beside me on the couch, and after a while Tom and Sally said goodnight, leaving us alone. Maria became braver when her parents left the room. She nuzzled my neck and pulled my head to hers in hard kisses. My arms were about her, and her breathing was as fast as mine. It was the first time I'd felt that sexual urge so demanding in her. I knew only her general history, the attack when she was 20. I didn't know detail. What interest does a serious boyfriend have to knowledge of his new lover's whole sex life? Should it matter? I had known her barely a month. We were not going to have sex yet, anyway. I was still moving slowly, and we couldn't have sex at my place. Smooth move, John. Living in a rectory, I thought with a smile. That could call up a whole new batch of demons for her. To have sex in her parish priest's house? I almost laughed as I kissed her at that thought. After a few more hard kisses, and I stopped myself with an obvious effort and slight shrinking away. She must have felt my effort, and she pushed her mouth to mine just a bit harder. Why was she so willing? Perhaps it was pinned up in her after so long that now she had a boyfriend her inhibitions were completely removed. I whispered, not yet. I want you, but not yet. We need to take it slow. It's you, you know, she said. I see so much good in you, and I've waited for someone like you. I've never been forward. Never. It has been a long time since I've had a boyfriend. Good. I don't need competition, I said. We were quiet together another moment. I sighed, stood, and said my goodbye. We kissed at the door. I avoided the news on radio and TV for the entire weekend because I thought it might include me. Sunday I sat in the big, dark living room with the overstuffed chairs and couch, the fireplace without a fire, and I sipped iced tea I found in the refrigerator. Father Philip came home around 7. Fixed some cold pasta salad, and we called it supper. An hour later, we went out and sat, and Father Mike joined us. Phil went in and found some carbonated water, which he poured into a wine glass. We sat quietly. Phil finally said, Father Mike told me you had done a brave and noble thing, and that you had suffered a great disappointment and loss in your divorce. I understand now what happened that awful day at the hospital, followed immediately by divorce. I wonder at your strength, John. Father said you have a hidden stamina. I think it's character. I said nothing. We looked out on darkening Ohio. Both priests just rocked. Sanctuary. Father Mike finally spoke. Security can keep the reporters out of the building, but they can't keep them from seeing you drive up or walk in, even if it's the back entrance. They can escort you through if there are too many. I laughed. It seems like a Jerry Lewis movie problem, doesn't it? Do you think they're bothering Karen, Ann? Phil said, oh, they are. One reporter called her the recently divorced wife. Another said she knew nothing about where you were. She had her kids, and she was angry as she said no comment to one. She has not given any interviews that I know of. Father Mike said, you have many requests for interviews. Late-night talk shows, Fox News, local TV in Cincinnati and Dayton, Indianapolis, Fort Wayne, newspapers. Finally, I am getting the attention I deserve, I said, facetiously. Now that I live with a priest, I become famous. Father Mike thought that was humorous. I said, you know, humanity has not looked too good recently. Mass murder, divorce, adultery, arrogance. Then I met this beautiful woman, moved into the nicest place I've ever lived, found a career, made 2 good friends. Toast, Father Mike said. We lifted our tea or water to not getting what we deserve in life. Here. After all, these guys believed in original sin. Life for some of them was a constant battle to overcome the worst angels of our nature. We sat in silence, allowing the idea of man's ubiquitous turpitude to impress us. It was a nice evening, Father Mike eventually wandering off and fill up to bed. I stayed on the porch, watching the night, contemplating things. The 2 priests saw my character in a different light than most people. To Father Mike, my humility was assumed. To Phil, I was strong, but to Karen and I was inept. I believed most of the world would have agreed with her. Humility was a virtue I used to hide my insecurity. Like my girlfriend had succumbed to the rather nots. In my case, it was the good enoughs. Not all of my decisions were without merit or virtue, but those regarding my career path had been motivated by fear. I was afraid to fail, and it wasn't failure if I did not try. Now Father Mike was pulling me into a program he was setting up, forcing me to consider a future, a man's future, an adult's. As the hospital grew in importance, Father knew it needed professionals to grow with it. Was I a professional hospital administrator or just a journeyman doing a job? I decided I would let the police and Homeland Security reports tell my story. It was not just humility. The most tragic day of my life, the day that led to the demise of my marriage and the loss of my children, was not a day for me to self-promote or gain money. I never wanted to remember that day. The hospital did not need a famous anti-terror. I was convinced that more publicity led to more terror. Stories were written and produced for paper and television, and I was the focus. The papers called me reclusive because they could not find my home. One TV news person called me a virtual hermit. I was a celebrity, and perhaps the elusiveness made them more interested. Phil would look for references to me in news articles and magazines, show them to me, and we discussed them on the porch. My parents spoke to a few reporters. They said I had a normal childhood, and they were shocked when I joined the Marines. Mom claimed I was gentle, and Dad nodded at that. I was a hero to some, not to all. Conjecture was mostly positive, but not all. Where had he gotten the pistol? Had he carried on hospital premises despite rules forbidding it? One right-wing outlet wanted to know what I had to hide, and then a terror outfit's essay hinted that I had not given the killers a chance to surrender, and that the shooting may not have been as all the Western reports claimed. One story even claimed I was a weapons expert in the Marines since I'd run a rifle range my last 7 months. I smiled at that. You don't have to be an expert to fire a pistol from 5 inches away, even with the wrong hand. Most of the errors could have been avoided with a little effort or a careful reading of the police reports, where the pistol came from, the time frame, etc. I wondered at the scruples of the journalistic profession. I went into work early over the next weeks, parking in a lot behind the hospital that actually belonged to a warehouse. I was sure to arrive before dawn and entered by a service entrance, which was usually busy with food and medical supply trucks so early. I waved to the hospital workers I knew, and no one else took note of me. I saw reporters out front during the day, and I was told 2 were watching the lot where I used to park. When I returned from the Cleveland program, they were gone. People noticed me during the course of a day. For some time, I was informally faded. People would point me out in the hallways, strangers recognizing me from the news media, or hospital workers mentioning me in passing to a friend. Lots of people stopped to thank me. Some kids wanted my autograph. Writing was difficult because of my hand, but I signed 2 papers and 1 cast and decided I'd beg off. I started practicing typing and found it very difficult and slow, but possible. My hand weakened very quickly. Cleveland would be difficult. In the cafeteria on my first day back, one of the serving ladies saw me, walked around the glass cases, hugged me in line, said nothing, and went back behind the cases. Visitors were smiling at this, not understanding a little lady with a hairnet hugging a guy for buying a coffee. To the woman behind me I said, "It's a hospital thing. We all hug." She smiled and shook her head, but then I heard "Buck" in quiet tones and all the workers were clapping and the visitors heard John Buck and they clapped, too. I said, "What's a guy gotta do to pay for his coffee around here?" And people laughed. I made my way out then, getting slapped on the back and arms, and had to drink the coffee. Some people held up cell phones. At lunch, I went to the cafeteria again and carefully hid in the line, talking to a guy visiting his newborn and wife up in maternity. All was well and mother and child were in good shape. His wife was breastfeeding little Lena, so he decided to come down and get some food too. He thought that was funny. Lots of things seem more pleasant when a new dad is giddy in the experience. I remembered 2 such moments and tried to keep the thought from bitterness. I congratulated him and shook his hand. "I'm John," I said. "Barry," he said. He looked at my name tag. "You're?" "Yeah, I get that a lot," I said, smiling and hoping he'd not point it out. He smiled and nodded, keeping my confidence. This time, it was one of the doctors who pointed me out to someone. Again, I heard my name being whispered and then spoken. People were looking around, so I looked around too. The cashier refused to take my plastic. "Sorry, Mr. Buck, this one's on us. You saved a lot of us right here, and your money's no good here." "Thanks, Megan." I thought, I should have picked up a dessert too. I took my tray to a table around a corner, facing away from the crowds. I ate in peace for 10 minutes. I turned in my tray and plates and made my way through the crowd when some knucklehead with a camera used a flash, calling attention to my exit. I waved and went on as I heard my name again. When would this end? I didn't want to be a curiosity. I had lots of messages sent down from the hospital secretaries. TV shows wanted me to call about setting up interviews. The Tonight Show was my favorite of those. I thought about it, but decided against any of them. They could read the police reports. I had set my policy and I would stick to it. Not because I could not face my celebrity, but because the event was awful and the infamy of it could lead to others. I had the hospital, meaning Kathy, send a statement to all the requests for interviews, simply saying, "No comment, I have nothing to say." I do not want to encourage further terror by talking about this horrible tragedy. I'd known Maria most of 2 months, not long, but long enough to think serious thoughts. The last week of September came. I needed to drive to Cleveland. The day before I left, late in the afternoon, we visited a park with a secluded path and a waterfall. We sat on the side of a large rock and talked, looking at the waterfall 20 feet away. I held her hand. I said, "Maria, I'm ready to fall in love with you. I've known you most of 2 months now. I've told you everything about myself. I also think you've told me the most important things about yourself. There's nothing about you I don't like. You're beautiful, gentle, smart. I want you. And just keeping my hands off you is difficult, but I'm not ready for a commitment. I'm not asking you to go steady or anything like that. It seems too adolescent. I'm asking if you're feeling these emotions too. I'm not promising anything. I want none from you. Not yet, but I need to know if I'm making this journey alone." She picked up my other hand, so she now held both. She took a deep breath. About 10 years ago, I was in college in Louisville. I had a new boyfriend, Brandon. I'd only known him 2 weeks, and we'd gone out twice to a movie and walked in a park. He seemed like a nice guy. He took me to a frat party. I trusted him, but it wasn't a frat house, just a house some of them rented. Anyway, Brandon was drinking with these other guys, and then they had some pills. They said it was meth. I tried to leave, but they wouldn't let me. They turned on some loud music. They started insinuating sex, touching themselves, and then me. My boyfriend held my arms, and then other two. It was a joke to them. I was crying and then begging him and them. They were making fun of me. Just then someone came to the door. It was a neighbor. The stereo was real loud. Brandon let go of my arms for a second, and I kicked one guy and ran. I escaped out the back door, but one of them caught my arm and I yanked it, and it dislocated my shoulder. I was outside screaming. I was so scared and it hurt. My arm was flopping. That neighbor heard the ruckus. I was screaming so loud and frantic and out of control, and she saw them and started yelling at them to let me go. A police car arrived then, and they ran off. I was under a bush and wandered out, stunned, screaming sometimes and raving, and the neighbor lady saw me and took me to the police. Brandon denied anything happened, but my shoulder was dislocated and I had scrapes and scratches all over. My clothes were ripped and there were marks and bruises, and I was literally raving. The lady testified to what she saw and heard. My boyfriend and one guy went to jail for a few months. The third guy testified against them, but I couldn't get up in front of people. I was in a hospital for 3 weeks. I was not lucid. I was incoherent for days. A mental hospital. She took another breath. I hurt my rotator when the shoulder dislocated, but they popped my arm back in easily. The bruises and scrapes healed, but I shrank from the world. I didn't go out. I didn't shop. I stopped going to church. I took 4 or 5 baths a day. I have not had a boyfriend since then. I didn't want a man in my life. I was incredulous. She was so beautiful that I couldn't imagine risking her disapproval. I'm so sorry, Maria. I'm stunned at the cheating. I am unable to find words. She kissed my right hand. It's been a long time. Carrie, she's my therapist, says I have to decide to rejoin the world. I want to. I'm ready to fall in love, John. I've never been with a man. Had sex. I've talked with my mother about how I am and they are wary because they know how difficult it is for me to leave the house or shop or walk past a shadow at night. I heard my parents talking once and they said they didn't think I could ever have a normal love relationship. Mom was crying. I said, "Do you think you could?" She squeezed my hands. "Only since I met you." I leaned over and we kissed, softly. It somewhat unbalanced us. Our perch was apparently precarious, and we reacted too late. I should not have let her hold both my hands. We slid clawing at the rock. There was a pool beneath us, luckily, perhaps 4 feet deep, and we went in with a plop. We were drenched and laughing as we climbed out, scraped and bruised, but all right. Our clothes were beginning to dry by the time we got back to the car. The money in my wallet was wet for a week, though, so I thought of that kiss every time I bought something. She told her mother, years later, it was the most memorable kiss of her life. Mine, also. I called Karen, and just to let her know I'd be out of town. She was supposed to get the house up for sale soon, as I had right to half the equity. Her machine sent me the message, so I left one. The goal of the Cleveland program was to prepare professional counselors and administrators to effectively help doctors and other licensed individuals to maintain or upgrade their professional status, and to prevent loss of license, certification, or other permission to treat patients. Hospitals did not want to lose good doctors every time they needed to leave town to upgrade or wanted to take a sabbatical. They wanted them back. I was out of my league at the Cleveland program. Most of the students were degreed in hospital fields, administration, business, management, personnel. I was the liberal arts major. I made up for my deficiency by studying late into the night, occasionally calling Father Michaels for advice, and making a nuisance of myself in the classes. A few of the students and instructors figured out I was that John Buck, and eventually they all did, but I just asked them to keep it quiet and they did. I actually announced it in one class when people were discussing it within my hearing, so we all repaired to a nearby watering hole and put it behind us. I told them what happened, how I was having trouble typing because of my wound, and sprang for another round of beer. My 15 minutes of fame ended in October, I hoped. One professor surprised me about a week later, saying in front of 20 of us that the class had gotten me a gift, a program that would permit me to speak into my computer and type for me. My life became much easier once I got the hang of it. They clapped for me, and I thanked them. Most weekends I drove home. One I did not was in mid-November. We in the program had presentations to make on Monday, simulated counseling sessions with a doctor of a certain age, talent, and education. We had to identify when the current license expired, alternative ways of renewing and upgrading, including classes, colleges in the area offering them, time the classes or demonstrations for advancement would require, and any other pertinent factors. Age of the subject, likely retirement, income improvement from upgrade or relic insure, etc. Not exciting, but real counseling. We had to understand the doctor's situation, family factors, complications, etc. I was assigned a thoracic surgeon, 34, wanting to upgrade, with a homebound wife and a child expected in a month. It was detailed and overly comprehensive. Rarely did doctors want or need complete portfolios of their experience and needs. Usually they wanted a particular program investigated, not wide-ranging things they might want to try someday. For this activity, I wrote page after page. All I had to do was talk clearly. It went well. I called Maria and we expressed our regrets about my absence. She got my attention when she said, "I love you," in closing. I whistled. I thought she must have smiled. "I love you too, Maria." Click. I felt like a teenager using a taboo word. The program would end in the 3rd week of December, just before Christmas. The course was quite valuable, but it could be overwhelming. Ultimately, any professional was responsible for her, or his own timely renewals and upgrades. It had to be the professional's responsibility to know the rules and procedures in her or his discipline, and to keep track of developments. Counselors could only aim and assist, notify, discover, and investigate opportunities. I understood better the complex world of medical licensure, but it was daunting. Father Michaels said on the phone one night, "That's why it was originally the responsibility of the different disciplines." I would return to God's abode after Christmas, and Father Michaels and I would begin restructuring or rescheduling in order to establish the new department. The program provided resources for me to find the accreditations and details of programs around the country and world. It was my job to make things work out to everyone's benefit. We could not lose good doctors forever because one wanted to spend 6 months working for Doctors Without Borders or learning a new and complicated technique or instrument. We wanted the successful doctor to return to our God's abode. I called Maria at least several times each week, and we would talk of family. She not met my parents, sports, and life in general. pleasant, usually ending with simple statements of love that no longer felt unusual. The calls satisfied me until I started noticing excitement. I wondered if she felt it too. I returned home on a Saturday morning with a certificate in hand, some graduate credits earned, thick binders, computer disks and drives, and huge numbers of websites I'd need to constantly update for program changes, either enhancement and reschedulings or closures. I also had promises of recommendations from 2 of my instructors in the program. It was a challenge to be expected to change the old system in a new way. I would need to visit hospitals to see how they did it now that I knew some questions to ask. It helped that the national and international medical associations were centralizing things. I drove directly to Maria's house. It had been almost a month since my last visit. It was cold and gray, but there was no snow or rain. When I pulled up to the curb, Maria opened the door and ran to me. I saw her mom watching, surprised that her daughter was so forward. Mom looked pleased, though. Maria threw her arms around my neck and kissed me. In her front yard in the middle of the afternoon, in front of her mother. She was beautiful. It was a long kiss. We walked arm in arm to the front door, held open by Mrs. Gray. "Welcome home, John." She kissed me on the cheek. "It's good to be home." "I like being home," I said. We spent some time talking about the program, how it would change my job, and things like that. Mrs. Gray sent us to the store to get some vegetables and other groceries. We went across town to the farmer's market, a large warehouse really, where the farmers sold produce directly. It was not the best time of year for it, but there was a Kroger next door also. Maria went with me, holding my hand and arm, and it was quite pleasant pushing a cart around and loading it with food. In the canned goods aisle, we came across Karen Ann. Maria felt me stiffen and stop right then, and she looked up. Karen Ann was pushing a cart, also, and she had Hanley in a pumpkin seat. Maria said, "What is it?" Karen Ann and Hanley. We came to them. Hanley looked wonderful, 9 months old now. Karen Ann looked strained, as if she were harried. Still sexy. "Hello, Karen Ann," I said, as she saw us. She just stared at me, then at Maria. "Oh, hi, John," she responded, looking at Maria. There was a pause. "Karen, this is Maria Gray." "Maria, this is Karen and Prin and her daughter Hanley." Hanley was spared the awkward moment by her age. Maria spoke up, a tight grip with her left hand on my arm. "Hello, Karen Ann and Hanley." She held out her hand and shook Karen Ann's. "John has told me a lot about you, Karen Ann. It's good to finally meet you." Karen Ann then hesitated and finally said, "John, there is so much to say. We do need to talk. The house is on the market, but it has had no offers yet. Really, if I could call you?" I wanted to say, "I've left you plenty of messages, and you've yet to return one," but I didn't. I nodded. "Of course. In a few days for sure," I said. "I've tried to call, but the house number is out of service, and your cell sends me the message." Karen Ann waved that off. She'd initiate contact. She had control. We all just looked at each other. I saw no reason to fill the awkward pause. Karen Ann surprised me by displaying jealousy, in a way. "So where are you living now? Are you two together?" This was not a side of her I ever expected to see. Maria, meek Maria, took the ball and ran with it. "We live on the other side of town," Maria said, implying we might be living together. I almost laughed. Father Philip would love the implications. "Well, I hope you are very happy. I have to keep Hanley moving, or she'll get fussy. I'll call you, John." "Sure. Soon. Good seeing you, Karen Ann, and Hanley too." We parted, to avoid each other for the rest of our time in the store. It had been an awkward moment. "Poor Karen Ann," Maria said soberly. "She doesn't know whether to admit she made a mistake or snarl at you." It was sad. She burned a bridge before she realized she needed to get back across. I decided that ultimately benefited me. "Karen Ann is very pretty," Maria said. "Is that the sort? I mean, is that the sort of woman you're attracted to?" Karen Ann was that kind of sexy that men noticed immediately. "Yes," I replied. "I'm attracted to beautiful women of all sizes and shapes. But I didn't love her because she was beautiful. Only, I thought she had a stronger quality of character. In the end, I was mistaken. Anyhow, I think I may be getting the better end of the exchange. When all is said and done, Maria was trying to be circumspect. I have a lot of baggage. It's not a contest. You are honest and good and beautiful. I don't wish I were back with her. I want to be with you. I like learning about us together." I had a thought, then, that I had been remiss. We headed to her house with the groceries. Her mother made a terrific meal for my first day home, with me talking about the program, Mr. Gray nodding and asking questions. I gathered up the dishes quickly. We cleaned things up and loaded the dishwasher. It was about 7 in the evening. I looked at Maria. I'm going to go see my parents. Would you like to meet them? I knocked and opened the door for Maria. My parents were there, coming to the door at my call. I had not seen them for a month, either. Then I turned to Maria. Maria, tiny and unassuming, had her bright red hair pulled back in a ponytail, emphasizing her clear, pale, translucent skin. My mother inhaled, startled by this little woman. My father did not move a muscle. I could see the effort it took him. If a small woman can be stunning or breathtaking, it was Maria this evening with her face framed by faux fur and quilted linings in the onset of winter. Mom, Dad, this is Maria Gray. We've been seeing one another for several months now. I thought it was time she met you. There was a pause while Mom found the right words to say. Maria was arresting. Quiet and stunning didn't go together in Dad's life. Beautiful women advertised. Yet here was a quiet, smart, and soft-spoken woman, not forward or pushy or extremely brash. She was retiring, obsequious, perhaps reticent and meek. Dad was smart. He saw a hurt and the pain in her. She was not just this visual package. To him, as to me, that made her all the more interesting. Maria spoke quietly, forcing Mom and Dad to struggle to hear her. I had seen this aspect of her. Quiet and bashful, I understood. But with my parents, her head was up and she was looking directly at them. I thought, she must really not want to make a mistake. They were trying to read her lips. She spoke so softly at first. Welcome, welcome, dear, my mother said, shaking Maria's hand and moving her toward the living room. Taking her coat, Dad stepped back and looked at me. With one of those looks fathers give sons who bring home a movie star, or a model, or Maria. Men, especially close family, know each other. In some situations, I felt a deep wish that everyone would like everyone, practically a prayer, and it was answered the way I hoped. Maria was unassuming. She was happy to sit on an old couch and discuss her new boyfriend. My parents could be swayed by a pretty girl, but they saw she was more. It involved character. Perhaps the most difficult time was when my parents asked about her life, her work, and her years. I realized the debilitation of her period of recuperation, but they didn't know her story, and yet she handled it truthfully if without specifics. She spoke of her recent work, of her family's help and support, of a terrible event that led to it all. My parents didn't pry more. She looked at me, smiling, and held my arm or my hand. Mom pulled out ice cream, and we each had a bowl as it melted, and it was a wonderful first meeting. Dad was laughing when Maria talked of her dad and her years growing up in Sky Gray. Maria had a tinkling soft laugh, and she had several opportunities to exhibit it. As first Mom and then Dad told childhood stories of my escapades in baseball and tennis. Maria mentioned she was descended from the founders of the town, Gray, and his Miami wife, she who shines. Actually, she was descended of their adopted child, one of peace. She didn't know the truth from the fiction of these ancestors, although her father had a cache of old accounts, diaries, and some stories passed down. That caught my attention and Dad's, because of our interest in local history. We left with the promise we would be back sooner rather than later. My mother hugged Maria, and Mom and Dad both stood at the door as we walked away in the dark. I held Maria's hand to the car and held the door for her. I got in my side and started the engine. Your parents are wonderful. You certainly know how to make a good impression, I said. I wonder sometimes if you are too good to be true. I'm just me, in love with you. It's a miracle. At her house, we walked onto the porch and I kissed her in our heavy coats in the cold. Kissing goodnight might be the best part of not being married, not being committed, not being ready. Without a sound, I heard music. Father Michaels laid out his plans for my new position when I returned to work the first week of January. The board has approved the new office, not just position. You will fill the lead position. You will have a secretary to deal with credentials, making sure all transcripts are up to date, that other achievements are fully. He explained in detail how he wanted the work done, asking my opinion, positing how many others we would need to hire. He had a whole handbook of plans, with suggestions for my consideration on points he considered debatable. It was the booklet he'd presented to the board. I plagiarized a lot of your reports and ideas from last summer, he said, and I copied the contractual system at Good Sam in Minneapolis where I used to work. He wanted to know in detail how the Cleveland program fit in, and I explained about new databases, professional organizations, and contracts. He wanted me to visit all the larger hospitals in the area and discover how they handled things. The board had established a committee to oversee and advise us. They were writing a step-by-step setup plan, based on Father Michaels' booklet and their own expertise. Several were on boards at other hospitals. One Dr. Johansson actually ran a similar program for a doctor assignment service. They wanted to meet me. I was astounded. An office, an assistant, soon probably another. responsibility for others. You may choose your own secretary or assistant, either from those already working for us with his or her consent, or a new hire. It is up to you. I'd like to see the job description you write before you post the position. Your new office is being renovated just above the main entrance. Your title is Deputy Chief Executive for Professional Credentials. You will report to me. You are not superior to the department heads, but you will work with them. They approve this position, and you in it, by the way. They know too many are slipping through the cracks as the hospital grows, not so much because of a failure to maintain licensure, but a sense that we are just a stepping stone. They have promised to help you and will not, repeat not, be annoyed at any question you might ask. That includes the color of the paint on the walls. He smiled. He meant the department heads would not hold it against me if I asked a silly or ignorant question. It was a lot to take in. I had not been responsible for others since I was in the Marine Corps. I wondered if all of this was happening because of the shooting. Father, am I being promoted because of the murders? He sat back in his chair, thoughtful. It was serious to him, as if it got to the heart of our sense of value. He steepled his fingers, looking at them as he started, but then at me. I first brought up the need for a change in this area last April, 2 months before that day. I even mentioned I thought you would be a good person for the position, but there are some weaknesses in your resume, if I may be frank, most of them having to do with your relative youth. You are 29, almost 30. You'll be dealing with doctors into their 70s. Conceited, insecure, critical, blaming. Your work was good, but you only have a bachelor's degree, and to some of these people that makes you crap. As we discussed the position, we decided you would be good in the office, but that you were not ready to run it. Then the shooting, then the revelation of who took down the killers, and most of all, then the fact you were not seen on TV, not heard on the radio, not even interviewed by the news magazines. To the department heads, you rose in their estimation. At this point, I said I was sending you to the Cleveland program and maintaining your salary here. They agreed. They know you are not shy, not reticent, but you are friendly and never say a bad word about anybody. They know you have had offers to tell your story, some of them for money. They reconsidered you. It's not the killing that got you this position, but how you handled it. They came to trust you. At the last meeting, they were unanimous about creating the position, putting you in it, and getting it up and running as soon as we can. I ordered an office renovated. I want it to be hard for doctors to avoid you, as often happens where credential updating is involved, so your office is front and center near the hub. I am very happy, Father. I will need advice. I'm here. Phil can even give you some. The supervisory committee can help. Dr. Johansson can help. Every department head. They all know you. They can be ambitious and manipulative. So the humility you assume might help. I doubt they understand it, and it's not in their nature to think deeply about the character of an administrator. He smiled at that. I'm nervous now. Thank you, sir. I will. He interrupted. Don't you want to know the salary? He paused. I can definitely say they will not understand you. He told me the number, and I realized I was going to have a future in Sky Gray. I went to my new wreck of an office. Construction mess was everywhere. The builders looked at me as if I were intruding in their dust. So I soon made my way to another part of the building. Late that afternoon, I received a phone call and promptly broke Father Michaels's confidence. I accepted an interview. Hello? I'm trying to reach John Buck, someone said. The voice was male, young, and familiar. I am he. I don't like to talk on the phone. I see it as necessary to make appointments and to woo women, but otherwise without much benefit to society. This is Tony Spagnol, Mr. Buck. I was the kid. Tony, what a surprise to hear from you. How did you get my number? I called the hospital, and they put me through to Father Mike. He said you wouldn't mind. Anyway, Mr. Buck, I have a favor to ask. I have a friend, and she's working for the school newspaper. She said it would be quite a scoop to get an interview with you, since you haven't given any. She's interviewed me and Mom, but we've done like a dozen. I was even on CNN once. He sounded impressed with himself. I could understand the importance he must have garnered by almost being killed in a massacre. He went on. So she asked me to ask you if you do an interview with her. Would it sacrifice anything if a school reporter got the first interview? By now I had no request coming in. There had been enough bombings and threats that God's abode was background information for those who lost no one, who knew no one, or who were not crippled or hurt. Give her my number and tell her to call me, I said non-committally. When would you like her to call? He said. Anytime. Tell her now. Okay? I laughed. Good hearing from you, Tony. Give my best to Marilyn and Cal. Sure, Mr. Buck. Bye. I heard him whispering as he hung up. He should have just handed her the phone, which he did. Her call came right away from the same number. I was enjoying this. Hello, Mr. Buck? This is Susan Daggers. I'm a reporter for the Clark High School Gazette. I was hoping, and I know Tony told you, I'd like to do an interview with you about the God's Abode Hospital shooting. Would you consider that, sir? Are you a good reporter, Ms. Daggers? I inquired. I'm learning. I think I've written some good stories about crime near the high school and some kids who got in trouble, although the advisor wouldn't print the one about the gang beatings. I say what's true to the best of my ability. Is this a what happened piece, or a commentary of some kind? What happened? I read some police interviews about you, but I found them confusing. You read them, huh? So the kid actually worked before I'd agreed to the interview. They interviewed me in pieces, several times, and so their reports were disjointed, I think. I said. You may interview me. Can you come to the hospital? I can show you where I was and where things happened. I heard a celebration at the other end. She thought this was her big break, I guess. I smiled. To be 15 again. Can I come Saturday? That way I won't miss school. In the morning would be best. I have a basketball game in the late afternoon. How about 9 in the morning? You can bring a camera if you want. No pictures of me. You can record audio though. Great. This is great. Thank you so much, Mr. Buck. 9 Saturday. I'll be there. We hung up. I'd forgotten that enthusiasm in youth. Saturday, she was right on time. I saw her enter and go straight to the information desk and ask for me. Jody was back after so many months and saw me approaching. You must be the reporter, Susan Daggers, I said to the kid. She was a taller girl with her hair in cornrows. She wore a dark pantsuit, low-heeled shoes, and carried a notebook and a small recording device. Jody could hear every word. Susan turned and smiled at me. You look just like your picture, she said. I've avoided photographers, but some have gotten me, so I don't know which one you mean. Would you like to talk to me in my office? Better yet, I'll take you around the hospital, show you where things happened. You can take pictures. I'd rather you not take any of me. There might be a crackpot out for revenge, or to make a name for himself. I want as few pictures of me out there as possible. Okay, she said. I'm a little disappointed about the picture of you, but I understand you're protecting yourself. So where did things happen? Sort of right here. I looked at Jody. Have you given any interviews? She said, I was mentioned in some stories, but just a line here and there. I thought you didn't give interviews? Only when I'm sure it's a good cause. Jody smiled, nodding. Susan, were you involved in the shooting, ma'am? Jody, lost part of my spleen when I got shot in the stomach. Susan hesitated with surprise. I thought, a lot of people here were involved, and there are some still in great mourning. We need to be discreet, I said. She nodded. The shooters came in there and started shooting everyone, Jody one of the first. So I showed her where the shootings were and where I was. I walked her through my actions, pushing doctors into the classroom, finding Tommy's pistol and ammunition, following the bodies to the cafeteria. She took pictures of all the different spots, especially the waiting room where several were hurt and killed. I detailed what I saw and did in the cafeteria. Tony was right here, I pointed. And one of the killers had his left arm around his neck with his rifle sort of pointing at the security guards across the room. Mrs. Spagnol was here, I pointed again. And her guy had his left arm around her neck and his pistol in his right hand pointed at her temple. His rifle was on the floor. It may have jammed, or he needed to reload and didn't have time when the security guys arrived. I signaled to the guards from here. I stepped forward and shot Mrs. Spagnol's guy as I knocked his pistol away. The bullet went through his head and hit my hand, I said, holding up my hand. And then I stepped over to Tony's guy and shot him. He was looking right at me by then, and I shot him under his eye. They both fell. Tony and his mom were okay, and it was over. I showed her my right palm with its angry scar. Wild, she said. I read you used to be a Marine. Did that help you in your actions? The Marines taught me to assess the situation and then act. Once I saw I could affect the situation positively, and I had a good chance to save some people and survive myself, I moved. I think I was only behind the killers maybe 10 seconds before I shot them. It was quick. Luckily, they were in an awkward position with the hostages and security guards. What happened to the guy you took the pistol from? He was already gone. I came across Jody. She was shot and down. Right where you saw her, upset, wondering if she was going to die. I remember I said, I hope not, or something like that. She told me she thought there were only 2 guys. You were married when this happened? Yes. We're divorced now. Shortly after the shooting. Actually, was she relieved to find out you were not seriously wounded? I think she was. She assumed I was a bad shot since I shot myself in the hand. I like that way of looking at it too. Did the incident have anything to do with your divorce? She asked. And was she really just 15? You do have a future in journalism, Sue, I said and took a deep breath. Yes. It revealed to us both that we shouldn't remain married. It was heartbreaking. The worst moment of my life, both at the hospital and at home. Why don't you give interviews until now? She asked. Because it feeds on it. One killer inspires another. A killing here and there. A massacre. It was the worst moment of my life. It ended so many lives. I don't want to remember it. I tell you because I want it to be over. Susan was a delight. We had some ice cream from the machine in the cafeteria and sat there talking about that day, who lived and died, what it seemed to be about. Then she asked if it had changed my attitude toward life. It's like anything else. People think I handled a bad situation well. Good, because a million things could have gone differently and worse. I had nightmares some nights, but it was not like it could have been. I was very sure I was doing something to help, and with that assurance I have peace of mind. 2 hours had passed. Her mother was due to pick her up. You have a basketball game? Yeah, we're playing Merciful Savior here in Sky Gray. At 4. Maybe I'll make it. My girlfriend went as Savior. I'd like to read your story, get a copy of the paper. If I may, I'll send you one, or just drop it off. I go right by here a lot. Mom works down the street. She's a lawyer. It should be in on Friday. Oh, here's my mom now, she said and stood up. I stood. Her mother was also tall, quite elegant, graceful. A pretty woman dressed quite professionally, probably her daughter's model in that regard. Ms. Daggers, we were just finishing up. I'm John Buck, I said as we shook hands. She had a very big smile. My daughter thinks it's quite a coup to get an interview with you, Mr. Buck. She twisted my arm. She figured I'd do anything for Tony, so she got him to call. She laughed lightly. Tony has a crush on her. I smiled and looked at Susan. So we know he has good judgment. They smiled and soon we said goodbye. I warned Father Mike about the interview. He thought it was the best way to defuse any lingering interest in my part of the incident. He laughed. High school paper? Tony's? Good choice. I called Maria and asked if she'd like to go to the basketball game at her old school. She said of course, no, well, maybe or rather not. Okay. So a little before 4, we found ourselves climbing into the stands to watch Merciful Savior play George Rogers Clark. The bleachers were full of fans from the 2 schools this Saturday. We stayed on the Merciful Savior side of the stands, but Ms. Daggers saw us and waved to me. Maria saw several people she knew and said hi. We found seats and I pointed out Susan to Maria. She's tall. Yes. You played basketball? I did until I found out it's a tall girls' game. The women in my family are always short, so we were encouraged to play short games, like softball or soccer or lacrosse. Field hockey, also. Not volleyball much, or basketball. I was a third baseman in hardball. Not that talented, but I could hit, and I had a decent arm for the throw to first. I sat the bench in basketball in high school. Maria smiled in that way of all women who know a man wants to impress them with every act. Throwing a ball, opening a jar, fixing a car, anything. Really? I said. Maria had a smile. It was fun. Susan turned out to be a marvelous forward. Savior lost the game on a free throw by a Clark guard. Maria was rooting for her alma mater, so I tried not to feel too much joy for Susan's win. When you only know one kid in a game, it draws your allegiance. Game over. Maria and I talked to a few of her acquaintances, and I introduced Susan's mother to her while the teams changed clothes or gathered things up. I think Maria liked being at her old school. She'd been apprehensive, but seeing old acquaintances stimulated her. She was laughing and joking and yelling at good and bad plays for most of the game. Quiet, taciturn Maria became incensed over a block or charge call. I looked at her, her face flaming red like her hair, all littleness of her looking for justice, standing and demanding. I pitied the referee. Maria hit me on the shoulder when she saw me smiling as she sat down. I saw the Maria she was still inside, that woman who came down the steps at her house and forbade me to leave. Wow again. Susan's story came out Friday. I found a copy of the paper in my box at work late that afternoon. Its headline was, "The Savior of Our God's Abode Hospital." It was mentioned on Fox and CNN, MSNBC, and others. Savior, with the U in the sky gray tradition, became my moniker, and so I smiled and shook my head. Nicknamed by a kid in her school paper. She was interviewed on several systems, Fox and MSNBC, and said, he doesn't want it to inspire a bigger tragedy. He says it was the worst day of his life. Susan was famous in her own way. Good for her. Of all the stories pinned about me, all the reports that identified and pictured me on all the TV shows, it was an interview by Susan Daggers that motivated a certain deeply hidden member of the IWC to action. He saw her on CNN and recorded it, Homeland Security later discovered. He was in no hurry, but he knew what he wanted to do, and he wanted to do it to the infidel savior. He had a job. No one realized he was illegal, and he had just contacted an old friend through the internet, surreptitiously, of course. The friend was not IWC, but word got around. Yassine was still loose in America. Phil came to like the double entendre that ultimately attached to me. Once a high school girl gave me a nickname. He was living with the savior of our God's abode, Karen, and called in March. She was businesslike and distant in tone and word. We discussed the asking price of the house and things of that nature. It was a small house, drafty and cheaply constructed. I thought the asking price a little high for it, but she wanted to keep the price there for a while. I brought up the children, but she said that she didn't want them around someone with an immoral living arrangement. She said, "I don't want my kids around people who flaunt their lifestyle living together without marriage." Yeah, she really said that. The woman with the 2 kids by one man while married and living with another. I wanted to laugh, but I contained it. Karen Ann, we're not living together. Maria and I, we never have. We're serious about each other. But no, we're not living together, I said. You assumed, and we let you. I apologize. Karen Ann was quiet. I wondered why she was not angry or combative. She finally said, "John, I wish things were better between us. Good night." She hung up. I would occasionally meet Maria at Mass, either on Fridays or Sundays. We would sit together throughout, she'd commune, and we'd walk over to breakfast at the local diner or on Fridays to her work. We'd hold hands. Maria would say hi to people she saw, but had never really met during her long years of reticence. We'd talk about her therapy, Thursday evenings, 7 to 8, baseball, politics, religion, books, and just about anything. She claimed to be a natural redhead. I said, someday she'd have to prove it to me. She had to think about that one a moment, but she actually had her tongue in her cheek then as she said, "Someday I intend to." I felt my heart thump, but it was a friendly, easygoing wooing. We were not adolescents, and as weeks became months, I saw the difference. We'd watch TV with her folks, or walk around the tennis courts watching the kids play, or read books in the same room. She came over to my parents' house and talked with my mom sometimes, then she'd call me up and ask me to my own home for supper. Mom and she went shopping at garage sales twice that I know, and Dad mentioned he'd sat with her watching an afternoon Reds preseason game. I had never considered that my girlfriend might become friends with my parents. I talked to them about Maria, her problems, the tragedy that brought on her illness, the reason she was so reticent. They had seen that in her, but they also saw her with me, and she seemed normal. The fact she was initiating contact with them was encouraging. They had discussed her lack of a degree, her working at a menial job, things future in-laws talked about. They had never meant it as criticism, and now they understood that the effects of the tragedy were long-lasting. "She's so gentle," Mom said. I avoided presumption. We were with each other several times a week, but not every day. I was in love, but it had only been a year since Hanley's birth, less for the divorce. We were alone and kissed often, but the petting was controlled and we avoided sex. There was still much about her I didn't know. She was alternately hot for sex or obviously avoiding it. We talked about it, but it was as if she wanted clearance or permission. I wondered if she didn't want to displease her parents. I discovered later that they were not the issue. She needed permission from herself. Maria asked me over for dinner one Sunday early in April. She and her mother were cooking and her father was grilling steaks. I was still taking my time in the progress of all these relationships. I was there an hour early to watch the Reds play on TV. Mr. Gray threw some steaks on the grill and sat down to watch the game and talk. I finally asked, "So how are you related to the founders of Sky Gray?" "I assume it's through you, Mr. Gray." So the steaks waited for the long and the short of the history of the town. I learned of the Scout Gray and She Who Shines, his Miami wife, of one of Peace Gray, their child found on the trail of the routed army defeated at the Battle of the Wabash. He explained how Peace's son Sky Stephen Gray ran a road stop here which was originally Sky Gray's stop, finally shortened to Sky Gray. He spoke of brave deeds 200 years gone, of Mad Anthony Wayne, fallen timbers, and the treaty at Greenville. Most of all, he talked of Michiganiqua, the great Miami war chief who wanted peace with the whites, who kept a small truce made with General Wayne in the farmhouse still used by Ben Gray. I said, "My father is gonna love this story." The steaks were well burned, but the rhubarb pie baked by Maria and her mother was tart and perfect. The women looked disappointed. We men thought everything was fine. Once late spring arrived on Sundays, the 2 priests and I began to sit on the porch again and watch the sun go down, the moon come up, or the rain fall. Sometimes on any night, I would sit alone for hours reading a novel in the dark using a flashlight or a lit-up reader. I had no official starting time at work. I just had work. I enjoyed sitting on the porch with the priests or a book. I missed the children. Karen and reported the house had a bid, but she was unhappy with it. She thought about it for some hours. It was just too low, she decided. I wondered if there was another motive for her now. As long as she was a single parent, the house was a good size for her family. Utilities were cheap. The mortgage was reasonable. The house was in a good part of the town on a slow street with other, similar houses, and she knew the neighbors. The kids could get to a playground without leaving the neighborhood, and perhaps she wanted to protect their inheritances. I wondered if she wanted to stay there, perhaps until she found another husband. One mid-May Sunday, Maria called me. That was unusual. She'd been with her parents all day at some flea market out of town after early mass, and I had not seen her. She just wanted to talk, she said. She asked what I did on Sunday nights, so I invited her over. She came by after supper, around 7:30 p.m., light at this time of year, and FRS Mike and Phil were sitting in wooden rocking chairs while I was in an Adirondack. That beautiful little redhead showed up on the sidewalk, hands on hips, wearing shorts and a light, short sleeve. It was a jaw-dropping outfit on her. "So, this is some sort of men's club, huh?" she asked, acting perturbed, voice a normal volume. It wasn't until later that I reflected that her usual reticence was reduced. She knew Phil and me, and a second Catholic priest probably kept her at ease. Only Mike was new to her, although she didn't realize who he was. "You're welcome, Maria, always," I said. I stood, which is tough to do gracefully out of an Adirondack. I went down the steps and met her. Father Mike and Father Phil stood. "Maria, this is Father Michaels, the hospital chief exec. Mike, Maria Gray, my girlfriend." They shook hands, and I saw a twinkle in Mike's eye. "My pleasure, young lady. Phil and John have told me of you." "It's good to finally meet you," Mike said. "It's an honor, Father," she said. "Have a seat, either the Adirondack or the garden chair," I said, holding her hand as she took my Adirondack. Phil laughed, and Mike smiled. I acted perturbed and took the garden chair beside her. I still held her hand. I have always loved to hold hands. And so on some Sundays Maria would join us, laughing and telling stories. She knew a lot of her family history from her father, so I would ask her, and Phil and Mike seemed to love the local knowledge. Phil was from the far side of the archdiocese, and his first contact with Sky Gray was after rehab when he was assigned as the parish priest. And Mike was from Indiana, getting to God's abode after working in several Catholic hospitals. Both of the men thought knowing more of the local history, even back hundreds of years, could help them understand the people and attitudes of a community like Sky Gray. They had both assumed the name of the town had something to do with the weather around its founding. They didn't realize it was a man's name. They had noticed that the area seemed obsessed with its own history. Anthony Wayne Middle School, Little Turtle Elementary, Sky Gray, George Rogers Clark High, Fort Wayne, Fort Recovery, Fort this and that. Even Hamilton and Greenville were originally Fort Hamilton and Fort Greenville. Maria loved talking about what she knew. She was changing during these months. She was strengthening in confidence and society. I was falling in love again, and this time not alone. I felt sure, carefully sure. No quick romance this. I decided I'd try to get her to marry me. On the closest Sunday marking 1 year since the massacre, the newspapers and other media had big stories on the shooting, on what was known of me, and of connections to other terror incidents since. Homeland Security had conducted a brilliant investigation and roundup of the conspirators. There were biographies of the two terror, the leaders of the IWC, calls for better vetting procedures for international travelers, and editorials about the nature of belief. According to one of its after-action reports, Homeland Security found that Yassin Talib read these stories, saw them on TV. He recorded several. He worked his job at the motel, scrounged to find money for another year of college, and according to Homeland felt a failure at life. He considered returning home, but he felt they would see him as a failure as he did. His brother had at least planned big, and though he'd hoped for much more, he had fought the infidels and died gloriously. Yassin was nothing if not deliberate. One Homeland analyst thought he was trying to find a way out of it. Maria asked me to accompany her to her therapy session on a Thursday evening in June. Her therapist had suggested I attend. I assumed it was an indication that I was becoming important in Maria's life, so I met Dr. Carrie Morgan. She was perhaps 50, tall and wide. She had a ready smile and eyes that made it clear she was nobody's fool. "Mr. Buck, I'm glad you're here," Dr. Carey said. "Maria's important to me. Of course I'll come whenever she or you ask," I said. "Maria has expressed her feelings to you?" "Yes. We've begun discussing marriage. My last marriage ended last August, and I met Maria shortly thereafter." Maria said, "John's met my parents, and I've met his." Good, Carrie said. I have Maria's permission to discuss all aspects of her case with you, correct, Maria? Maria smiled. Of course. Okay, John, I'll put you on the spot. What behaviors do you see in Maria that hint at her problem that we've been dealing with for most of a decade? She seems fragile, unsure of herself in certain circumstances. She's easily frightened of the dark, of groups of strangers, of individuals, of going up to strangers, of making phone calls. She's very hesitant to make a call, as if she must gather her willpower. When meeting someone, she speaks very quietly at first, and it's hard for them to hear her clearly. Then she gets louder as the conversation goes on. But I've known many women and some men like this, seen doctors like this at the hospital, with all these traits. So you feel her conditions within manageable limits? Yes, very much so. She forces herself to do what she must, or what she really wants to do. She is more at ease with priests. I saw her forthright and friendly without any hesitance meeting my boss. I can see her as my wife, as mother of children, dealing with their behaviors. With me. It felt weird to say these things aloud, with Maria right there, identifying my dreams to a woman I just met. Well, Maria, what do you think of that assessment? Maria was sitting on a couch with me, and she had my left hand between her two. I've come out more since John, but I lean on him. Like I'm a little nervous tonight with this meeting, and so I cling to his hand, she said, smiling. I noticed, Carrie said. That's not a big deal. It's very normal behavior when nervous to seek comfort from one you love, or see as a protector. I hold my husband's hand likewise. Maria said, I don't think much about running to the store anymore. I like church again, and I'm ready to join the council or something. Whether or not John does anything there. He doesn't believe. I'm thinking about the future. Those children I hope to have don't seem so far away. Marriage seems like it could happen sometime. But there are so many things I might do wrong. She couldn't talk for a moment. She was overwhelmed. In her mind, having a child, raising a family, was her goal, her image of success in life. I thought of her parents, and it was easy to understand. Carrie smiled and said, How do you feel about Brandon? Brandon was the boyfriend who assaulted her, she explained to me. I hate him, but it's different now. I think if I saw him in a store, I'd just go the other way. I used to think I would throw some sort of fit or breakdown, she said. There was no fidget in her at that moment. Her eyes were steady, and her one hand held mine loosely. How would you handle things if John weren't around? Would you be able to handle an emergency with a child? Maria was silent. I'm afraid I'll freeze up or hide. I don't want to do the wrong thing. Or what if I made things worse? She was holding my hand harder, projecting herself into difficult situations anyone might face. A grease fire in a pan, a child climbing too high in a tree, or playing near a stove with boiling water on top. She feared her failure, making the wrong decision, and being unable to protect the kid. Or worst, causing serious injury by accident. She feared she wouldn't act because things might go wrong. Carrie said, I'm very confident now that you will do the best you can, make the best decision at the time. It's all any of us can do. I remembered a mother in a movie asking her sports writer husband, how many of those ball players grow up afraid of losing their father's love every time they go up to the plate? And her husband said, all of them. I said, I will love you. Whatever choice you make in any situation, for our kids or someone else's, no matter how it turns out, because I know your heart. Both her hands held mine, and Carrie watched. We talked then about this and that, the attack at the hospital, my 15 minutes of fame. Carrie had become Maria's friend over the years of therapy, and she knew Maria, but she was her professional friend. It was not a session of couples therapy. It was not about mending or helping us as lovers. It was about Maria, her personality, her principles, her character, and her fears. Carrie said, remember how long it took us to get you to run and run alone, and then get a job and do it? You made friends. You've now met a man and fallen in love. You're going to movies and church and growing independent. You're making plans. John, a lot of this is to please you, or because she has such strong desire to be with you. Carrie looked directly at Maria then. Have you two had sex? Carrie asked. She looked straight into Maria's eyes, as if the answer was crucial. Maria looked indignant and said, when we have sex and decide you need to know, we'll tell you. If we were here to deal with some issue of sex, we would talk about it. Carrie hesitated and then started to laugh, and I realized the reason she'd asked. She knew Maria very, very well. Maria lost the hint of indignation in her expression when she saw me smiling. She sounds like some Marine wives I remember, I said. You seem to know her pretty well, doctor. Carrie said with a smile. She is very strong in her conceptions of appropriate behavior, of how people should associate, what is private and what is open for comment. It's part of why she's so hard on herself. I think we can reduce our meetings to once a month for now, Maria, and end them in a few months. You're ready. Of course, you may always call me and set up an extra meeting if you want, and I may call just to see how you're doing. How's that sound? Maria was surprised, but then she understood. Her indignation Carrie took as strength of character. Good. Great. Are you sure? Carrie was just smiling and nodding. Maria took a deep breath. Like this moment had to come sooner or later, and it was now. What'll I do on Thursday nights? She said. You'll think of something. Play softball, join the choir, work at a soup kitchen. You'll be okay. The two of them felt a happiness that many years of struggle were finally improved. I stood up. It's been great meeting you, Doctor. Maria hugged Carrie then. They said some things quietly and with smiles, probably about me, and we left. Maria asked me to her cousin's wedding in August, the largest family gathering I'd ever attended. I wore a tie and sport coat. I had Maria connect the top button on my collar because the neck was tight and my right hand wasn't up to it, even after 14 months. Dr. Beetol said that was unlikely to improve much. The tie was okay. I handled that myself. August was very warm, uncomfortably so, and I didn't know the bride or groom. I only knew Maria's parents and relatives she'd introduced over the year. Maria wore a light green dress, which was stare-worthy. Girls with good arms should show them. It was hard not to stare at her, and a few men did. I told her later that I wrote down their names and intended to deal with them soon. The ceremony was held in a parish a few miles south of Sky Gray. The building was small, and there was no school for this small parish. The kids bussed into Sky Gray to Catholic school or public. Maria dipped her fingers in the holy water as she entered, crossed herself, and I walked beside her to the bride's side of the church. She was Teresa Gray, marrying a guy from Hamilton named Bryce Garrison. I wondered if Bryce was Catholic. There was no mass included with this ceremony. We sat in one of the last few pews. I noticed a few people turning to look at Maria, or me, usually smiling. A little girl waved to her from 2 rows up, and Maria smiled and waved back. By the time things started, the church was full and the air conditioning was straining. There was an indoor reception in the church room beneath the nave. There were a lot of people present. Every table was filled. Maria took me from table to table, introducing me to them and vice versa. I smiled and confessed I'd probably forget all the names. After going to every table, Maria explained about crazy Aunt Lori and Aunt Dr. Beth and Cousin Bob who just got out of jail and every other bit of family gossip, innuendo, mystery, and illness. I asked her, "Why are you telling me all this?" "Because Mom always said you shouldn't marry someone who didn't know every family scandal and crazy person." I looked at her. "So you think I might want to marry you?" I asked, as if there were doubt. "I know it would be well worth your while to consider it," she responded with newfound conviction, and kissed me. It wasn't a quick kiss. I heard several people start to applaud nearby, and I must have blushed. I sat beside her quietly for a bit. She talked to Aunt Gertie or Uncle Link, and then I reached over and grabbed her hand, so small and delicate and slender in mine. "I love you too," I said. She squeezed my hand. I wanted to talk to her now, alone, privately, about private things. I wanted to talk about marriage and family and futures. Suddenly I wanted to have all those conversations that lovers need to have before marriage. Religion, children, homes, goals, love, life. Life was full of the potential of happiness, the potential of family, the potential of sex, the potential of someone wanting me. Someone wanting me. We needed to talk, and it felt urgent. I pulled my chair closer to Maria's. Just then, some master of ceremonies turned down the lights and started to talk. They had a spotlight. He pointed out the oldest present, the ones who traveled farthest, the youngest, and so on. The light found each one. I paid no attention, but then I had to look up. "Yes, we have the savior of God's abode hospital, John Buck." "Stand up, John." A spotlight. When did they start having a spotlight at a wedding reception? Shone on me and Maria, she being much worthier of people's attention. But they had found me, and so I stood and waved as they all clapped, and I sat. I whispered to Maria, as the clapping died out and the MC went on, "Loving you is hard sometimes." She laughed and said, "I think it was my dad." I said, "You owe me, Gray. It's lucky you're the most beautiful woman in the room." She looked at me intently, deeply. I looked into her eyes. Deep, dark blue. She leaned against me in the dark hall. She kept it there until the spotlight went off and the lights went up, and I wondered if I'd have to walk around in the next few moments. I mellowed without incident. I liked the looks we received from various relatives and friends of hers. I assumed many of these people had noticed her cloistering and welcomed this change. She was probably the subject of years of family concern and talk. She sat with me, leaned into me, slowly turned her head and looked at me and kissed my lips. It felt right, gentle. Every kiss with her did. Someday, when you're ready, when all is right, I want you to ask me to marry you, she said quietly, or as quietly as you can at a noisy gathering. Very good to hear, I replied, my lips brushing her ear. I don't want to ask that question without knowing the answer ahead of time. The DJ started playing songs, and I asked her to dance. She put her arms around my neck, and we danced poorly but close together on the slow songs. We rested on fast ones, but I think her parents liked seeing us so close together, so openly loving, so much a pair. When it was almost over, dancing and hardly moving, she and I kissed gently on the dance floor. I took her hand and told her parents we would go straight home. Her father nodded after initially hesitating, as if he wondered why I was bringing her home this night. Maria went to the restroom then, and I stood with her father. I love Maria. I can see. Her mother and I are pleased. And I think she wants to marry you, John. I think she's much stronger now than when we first met. He nodded. He put his hand on my shoulder. She is special, and meeting you has been a blessing. Are you ready to propose? I wanted a year. A year after divorce. A year knowing her. Yes, it'll be soon. She means so much to me. My sentences were short, a staccato. Her father said, we should meet your parents. Grill out next Sunday afternoon, our house? I nodded. Maria and her mother returned, and we left holding hands. I asked her to a classy restaurant near Dayton for Friday evening. I made reservations and asked her to dress nicely. She did, and I wore a suit. It was early September now, not quite autumn. I made a point of touching her when I saw her. I held her hand, touched her arm, held her chair, and let my hand linger on her neck and shoulder. She shivered at that, leaned her head to my hand until her cheek touched it. I whispered in her ear, you're gorgeous. I can't look away. I wasn't alone in appreciating her appearance, but I didn't want to mention others on this night. The light was soft. I was glad. The table was small, with a candle. I held her left hand in my right as I spoke to her. Maria, I have never been so in love. She said, I wouldn't want to be anywhere else with anyone else. I don't care where I am as long as it's with you. I felt each finger. I spoke softly when I reached her ring finger. I love you too. I hope you'll always love me. I'm new to being loved. I hope you'll say yes. I pulled the ring from my pocket, still in its box. I released her hand and opened the box. I spoke softly, sure that only she could hear. Please marry me? I turned the box so she could see it. Yes, yes, she almost whispered, looking first at the ring but then at my eyes. I promise to love you. I'm so overwhelmed that you love me. I took the ring and slipped it on her left ring finger, so thin, delicate. She inhaled at the act in the moment. I smiled and held her hand. Her eyes were bright, wide, shining in the flicker of the candle flame, dark blue. John, she said, as if reciting something she had practiced. Since that first moment we spoke, I've wanted you to love me. I never thought it had happened for me. I thought love and marriage and family had passed me by. No man was okay. She cried gently for a moment. We sipped wine. I held her ring hand. Happy the ring seemed to fit. Some people at 2 other tables saw her tears, the ring box, her left hand in mine with the diamond ring, recognized our moment and smiled. It was a sweet and loving evening. The service was excellent. The food was terrific. The woman with me was lovely and rare, willing to commit herself to me for life. We left the restaurant around 9, arm in arm. She rested her cheek on my arm occasionally. Do you have more planned for this evening? She asked. Yes and no. But we need to talk. So I'd like to stop soon at a place I know, where you and I can discuss all the things engaged couples should discuss. We found that place just outside of Sky Gray, a preserved water wilderness that was not buggy in mid-September. If we go somewhere, would your parents object or be disappointed? I asked. No, it's our decision. She called her parents and said they shouldn't worry. She would be late. Her father said, we love you and completely understand. Are you engaged? Yes. Her mother said, I'm so happy for you. Come home safe tomorrow morning, honey. We parked. I pulled a bag out of the back seat, which Maria looked at. I thought it might get cold, a blanket and quilt. We walked in the cooling evening breeze. I held her hand. It was almost completely dark. We were alone. In the far distance we heard the highway, but we saw only a distant glow. We sat on a park bench, looking out at a wetland glistening in moonlight. She slumped against me, my arms around her and hers on mine. I whispered in her ear, "Maria, I want you so much. We have not talked of sex." "I've been afraid of sex," she said, turning her head and kissing me easily. "I've avoided it. Only with you have I been able to imagine enjoying hands on me." She was breathing hard. "I want it. I even think I need it, but I want it right. I'm 30, because of. I know how unusual that is. It's time, John. I want you. I love you. I trust you're sincere. I've never trusted anyone else like this. Certainly no man." I held her against me, and we sat on a park bench looking at the moon and stars lighting the area, glistening on still waters. "I know a place," I said, waving to a path barely discernible through the trees and undergrowth, away from the maintained one. She said, surprised, "Outside?" She smiled. "Let's go." I was surprised at the husk in her voice. I kissed her again. We made love and it was amazing. Then we dressed, brushed the leaves and twigs from us as best we could, and returned to the car. I drove her home, walked with her to her door, kissed her, and let her enter alone to see her parents, to show her ring, and possibly to discuss our new relationship. She said later that they were shocked she was home by 3 in the morning. They'd assumed we'd gone to a motel. Maria said she just smiled, shook her head and said, "Better. Some things were too important for sharing, or didn't deserve to be." I called my parents next morning, told them I had proposed and Maria'd accepted. Mom squealed. I wondered if she was jumping up and down. Dad just harumphed and said, "Good, good." I couldn't remember how they'd acted when I'd proposed to Karen, and I stopped by to drive them to the picnic the next morning. When we arrived, I introduced Mom and Dad to the Grays and the smiles seemed genuine. Mom and Dad hugged Maria and exclaimed over the ring, and I thought Mom had found some sort of soulmate in my wife-to-be. Perhaps she had. The Grays and the Bucks were easy talkers. There seemed to be friendship and interest, the Reds, the town, the history, us, everything. Mr. Gray burned the hamburgers. The wine was good. It was a gentle and friendly picnic. I sent a text to Karen and, proposing that she keep the house as she seemed settled in it, and that if she ever sold it I would expect half of the equity as of the date of the divorce, which at modern rates would have been $5,000. It was not insignificant, but I didn't like the feeling that I was pressuring her, and she didn't have the means to move without using her children's money. The kids needed a home and a future. The divorce had made our marriage a deadweight for her. I had moved on. She replied 3 days later that she had spoken to her lawyer, and I should soon receive some papers to sign. 2 days later, they did and I did. We set a date for the wedding in March. It allowed me to settle into my new situation at work, which was growing with my office. I had now 2 assistants and 3 full-time degreed specialists. I wondered if they minded working for the least qualified administrator in our department, but no one said anything because I was the one who hired. I was beginning a master's program designed for me by Father Mike and a professor at the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine. I would work mornings or afternoons in my office and attend classes or seminars at various schools or hospitals in the afternoons or mornings depending on the day of the week. My notes to Father became notes and essays to Dr. Loren Fortner in hospital administration education. The University of Cincinnati had pioneered the cooperative education concept 100 years before, so it was accepting of my circumstance and willing to work with me when Dr. Fortner volunteered. It would last a year, perhaps 18 months, depending on my progress. The hospital was picking up the tab, and somehow I was awarded a federal grant. Maria's desire to be wed in the Catholic Church meant I had a hurdle to jump. I had to apply for a declaration of nullity, annulling my first marriage in the eyes of the church. That was not as hard to get as I thought it would be, but it took time. Karen Ann's lack of fidelity was well proven. Dylan's birth within 18 months of our wedding was seen as evidence she had not been sincere in her vow even from the inception of the marriage, especially since we had been separated for 8 months in the first 10, which was a kind way to put it. We should not have been married. Several people wrote essays, Father Mike, Father Phil, Maria, about my character and answering questions posed by the church. Some months later a board approved the application and I was free from Maria. Ironically, it was my Protestant mother who was most pleased by the declaration. A few weeks before our wedding, we purchased a house ready for move-in, in less than a mile from God's Abode Hospital. It was a short walk to Maria's motel job, almost equidistant to our church and elementary school. It was not far to the public school either, I reminded her. That would be a future discussion and decision. She wanted to continue to work until she found a better situation. Every extra moment was then spent cleaning, painting, buying some furniture, and generally getting the house in shape. It was not going to be ready. We'd need more furniture and painting and some plumbing replaced. But then whoever finishes work on their house, At any rate, we would come home from our honeymoon to our own home. I had been living with a priest. She had been with her parents. Now 13 months into my revamped job, we had enough income we would live in the old part of Sky Gray. The house had a porch, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a kitchen and dining area and living room. Hardwood floors, older but working appliances. It was a new beginning for us with each other. We could hear bats hitting balls when kids played in the fields behind, but we would have to put up with dust on everything when the fields were dragged. On the far end of the park were basketball courts, a tennis court, and a public pool. We were to be married at our church with Father Mike as celebrant. Since I had no formal association with the church, and Maria was Catholic, the priests decided that they should examine my beliefs. They insisted that our plans should include children, and they wanted my guarantee they would be raised Catholic. Catholic organizations or officials had created my job, found me a home, helped me through a divorce, ushered me to Maria, and introduced me to my best friends. I was happy to agree. Being without a religion, but perhaps not without faith myself, it was not a hard decision. We went to a series of meetings of affianced couples called pre-Kana, intended, I think, to get couples to look at the realities of marriage. Some of the couples had not considered the religion of their future children, or even how many children they might want. I think Maria was surprised that the others had never discussed how things would actually work in their marriages. We had a smaller wedding, by some standards. Perhaps 100 people were at the ceremony. Maria wore light blue, her hair in rivulets framing her pale face, and I thought she looked like St. John in Da Vinci's Last Supper, but much more beautiful. I wore a black tuxedo. She had Eva from work as maid of honor. I had Father Phil. He wore a formal dark cassock and collar. When Father Mike said we could kiss, Maria reached up with her left hand and touched my face as I bent to softly press her lips, and my mother said it was the most moving kiss she'd ever seen. I recall the feeling of her fingers grazing my cheek at that moment. We left the reception around 9 and drove a bit down the road, spending our first night in a little motel. Maria kissed me with her arms around my neck, said I should get comfortable, and that she would like to wear some special clothes for me if I'd give her a minute. She emerged and said, "Are you ready to make love to your wife?" It was a night of passion and love. Next day, she let me recuperate, and then she did things to me that I loved. All the hesitance and delay, all the shyness were gone when she and I were alone. She looked at me once as we were loving and said, "I'm so glad you came into my life. When I'm with you, I'm better." Perhaps she became pregnant that first night, or perhaps it was later. I hope we have a boy, so he may be more like you. I kissed her, her arms about me, and I wished that this happiness might endure, every moment, every time. "Are you saying a daughter can't take after her father?" I asked as we drove toward home. "No, I just think you should accept a compliment and let me love our child, hoping he's the sort of person you are." Considering how my first wife felt about me, I decided it would be foolish to argue. "Well, I think her mom is pretty great, so I won't be upset if she takes after you." Thereafter, I referred to the baby as she and she as he. It confused some people in conversations later on, but we enjoyed their confusion. We returned to Sky Gray happy and excited. Lovers married, living in a house big enough for more than one child, loving parents nearby, and ready for our lives. There was a ball practice taking place on one of the fields behind our home, despite a threat of rain. It was cool, like March was. We could hear children yelling, the plink of metal bats on balls, people clapping. It would be a good place to start a family. I carried Maria and our unborn child in the door when we arrived. It started to rain as we held each other and napped in our own bed after the long trip, and all the luggage on the porch was soaked. Police and news reports had publicized my name for my actions at God's abode. Wikipedia gave me several lines for the hospital massacre. My plagiarized quote was popular on the internet, several commenters wanting me sued, others defending me for the heat of the moment. One thread with close to 100,000 comments was all about what I should have said after shooting the 2 guys. For over a year, I was a cause for easy speculation. There were websites condemning me. Most of those were in Arabic. I don't know if Mom noticed my celebrity. She never mentioned my statement. It had a bad word, and I'm sure that embarrassed her. She didn't use the internet much, but she must have seen my 15 minutes of fame. Luckily, it diminished greatly after first Susan's interview, and then once the anniversary of the attack passed. After the final event, I obtained copies of the major reports. Eric Remarque said he was the primary author of one of them. He felt like he knew the terror very well by then. The 2 God's Abode killers were Ibrahim Aya and Yusef Talib. They staged at the farm in Indiana, about 60 miles away, and drove a rented car into Sky Gray for the attack. They wanted to make a big splash in the countryside, let everyone know it could happen anywhere, not just in a big city. Apparently, they had discussed the attack, planned it for several months, and entered the country 3 months before to case the hospital and gather the weapons. They left some record of all this planning, perhaps emails or chats, which led to the arrests after the hospital attack. I didn't know if they had funerals or cremation, or what. Later investigation by the FBI and Homeland Security reached certain conclusions. Yassin Talib, Youssef's younger brother, was in the U.S. on a student visa but supposedly left before his brother arrived. Video showed him at the airport a few weeks before the hospital attack, although the flight he supposedly boarded did not show him disembarking. He was not known as a member of the IWC, so he was not immediately of concern. When his brother and Aya carried out their attack, he was in a motel outside Indianapolis, probably cheering them on. When the attack was executed, he must have been disappointed at the scope of the killing. They had expected to rampage through the hospital, killing patients in rooms, leaving hundreds dead. Special Agent Remark mentioned that their communications indicated disdain for the rural, using Arabic terms that could be translated as rubes, hicks, or hillbillies. His brother dead as expected. Yassin went underground and no one knew what became of him until he showed up in Sky Gray so many months later, almost 2 years. He collected news accounts of the God's Abode attack, printing them out from the internet if written or recording them if on TV. He heard eventually that I had killed the gunman. He saw the interview of Susan Daggers on at least one cable network, and he must have heard that I did not want to encourage future attacks. Remark said Susan's interview by CNN was on the disc inside Yassin's CD player when Homeland found it. He heard of my divorce from Susan and others. Yassin's interrogation yielded some information not classified. He put 2 and 2 together and decided I was afraid of retaliation and had divorced my wife so soon after the attack in order to spare her and the children. He possibly saw the one interview Karen and gave, in which she said that my actions were completely out of character. She said she was shocked at what I had done because I was normally quiet and unassuming. She wondered at the fuss, implying that it could not have been significant because John had done it. Yassin may have shaken his head at this inept attempt to mislead him. He never considered that the Buck family disintegrated from within. Yassin, some sources said Yassin, was not trained, not cool, and not experienced. Remark said his lack of training helped him hide, but his anger boiled during the many months, and his preparation was not professional. He was angry that his brother had died so early in the attack and that so many were later captured. He felt abandoned. His brother had been his contact with the organization, and the FBI never found any indication that the remnant IWC in the Middle East even knew of his small involvement in the massacre. He had been in the U.S. for several years, going to school, scouting locations that his brother reported to the organization, and generally avoiding much participation. He was angry at the failure of the mission, but he was a student and a frontman and not a professional killer. He suffered a crisis of conscience as to what action he could or should take. He stalled for many months. He finally came to a purpose, and he knew the enemy after years living among them. He wanted them to hurt. Infidels had one virtue. They can love their families. So he would hurt the Savior by killing his family in front of him and so teach a lesson to America. Perhaps he could even escape afterwards. He rationalized his survival. He would live to kill another day. Perhaps he could return home to accolades. He equivocated, emailing friends and relatives in the Middle East. He lived on the internet. He had few contacts except for his work as clerk and occasional visits to stores. He prayed more in his solitude. Apparently, someone, Homeland Security did not identify who, encouraged him to wreak vengeance on the celebrated but reclusive savior of God's abode. He had the old address. He was sure he could entice or trick me to the house, despite the faux divorce. An email was found that indicated he accepted the mission, coincidentally sent on our wedding day. Our wedding had gone largely unnoticed by the media. My desire for privacy was known and interest in my life had waned. He put his plan into action the day Maria found out she was pregnant. It was late on a mild night in April, about 5 weeks after Maria and I wed. The day Maria told me she was pregnant. He acted alone, as he had lived since the massacre without close contact with others. He had one pistol and several magazines of ammunition. He had 5 one-gallon cans of gasoline. His plan seemed to be to tie up everyone in the house, get one of them to call me if I was not there, and then when I showed up, to shoot us all. Then he'd fire the house. He expected to escape once he had killed the 4 of us and fired the house. After dark, he parked on the street in front of Karen Ann's house, using a car given to him by Aya just before the massacre. Karen, Ann, and the 2 children were in the bedrooms. Dylan was asleep in his bed and Hanley was in her new one across from him, but still awake and cooing. Karen Ann was reading in bed, a drink on the nightstand, but she wasn't drunk yet. It was about 10:30 at night. Talib went to the back door, found it locked, and so he burst it open. He broke the glass in the window doing it and cut his shoulder slightly. He ran down the hall, looked in the master bedroom and found Karen Ann, who was fumbling for her cell. She screamed and wished she'd had her phone handier. Talib grabbed her by the arm, pointed the gun at her, and made her get on the bed face down. She probably feared assault at this point. He put the pistol to her head, told her to cross her wrists behind her, and then used long plastic cable ties to bind her. They were effective. Karen and implored him not to hurt the children. He pulled her into the living room and sat her in a chair, binding her legs to it with duct tape. Her back was to the front picture window. He found the two kids and, carrying each under an arm, put the screaming children on the couch. He used cable ties on their wrists and ankles, but they were not tied to the couch. The kids became quieter when he put tape around Karen Ann's head as a gag. He tried putting just a strip over her mouth, but she was able to undo it with breath, so he had to wind it around several times. They all sat for a while. He was waiting for the kids to quiet down. They didn't want to, so he put several winds of tape around their heads also. It was about 11 in the evening. Once everyone was settled and quieter, he unwound the tape from Karen Ann's head, causing her some pain as it was suffused with her hair. He asked for my phone number, but Karen Ann refused. She promptly told him the number when he pointed the pistol at Hanley. He said he wanted her to call me and get me over right away. He dialed for her. It was 11:13 in the evening when she called, according to my cell phone. Hello? I answered. I saw Karen Ann's number on the screen. Maria and I were walking up to our house after visiting our parents with our good news. John, it's Karen Ann. She was louder than I'd ever heard her on the phone. She took a breath. You need to come over right away. It's Dylan. He's gone and I can't find him. I paused for a moment, thinking this was probably nothing. Suddenly she turned to me for help. She was obviously not calm, running her words together. You've looked in all the rooms and behind the couch? Where could a 3-year-old kid go in such a small house? Yes, and he's gone. Just gone. He was here and now his bed's empty. Hurry. John, he's never done this before. Be careful. Click. I back-dialed, but it was not answered and sent me to messages. Maria saw my concern. What is it? We stood on our porch. That was Karen Ann. She says Dylan's gone and she can't find him. I think I need to go. She needs people to look, I think. I turned and started back to the car, and of course, Maria was beside me. I'll go too. 2 of us looking are better than 1, especially if he's out in the dark. I took it as a matter of course because of my concern for Dylan and confusion about Karen Ann, but this immediate volunteering in the dark must have indicated more confidence for Maria. I wondered fleetingly if she worried about me being around Karen Ann. I considered calling the police, but I quickly assumed she had. Police might not worry about a teen missing at 11, but a 3-year-old would get a quick response in Sky Gray. Why had she said to be careful? Maria, she said something weird. She said I should be careful. Has Karen Ann ever, in the time you've known of her and me, has she ever shown concern for me? Maria thought. No, but it may mean she's just worried about him. Yeah, or maybe it was a message, I thought aloud. Whether or not it was intended, did it mean something? I decided to take it as a signal, not enough to call the police, but to approach with some care. Let's go over, but be careful, like she said. We parked down the street and just around the bend, at a sharp angle to the front windows. From 100 yards away, we saw a strange car in front of the house. Maybe she called others, and they'd come to help, or there might be something going on in the house. The place was dark. I said to Maria, the porch lights off. No visible lights from inside. Does that seem strange to you? When a kid is missing, and you're calling people to help? Very, Maria said. You'd turn on every light to find a missing kid. Something might be going on in the house, I said to Maria. I don't know that car. Maybe it's a friend. Maybe not. Follow me. Stay close. Okay? I looked at her in the weak light, and she smiled and squeezed my hand. We went around the neighbors' houses in a jog, through their backyards, and discovered a new fence at the Murphy's house, luckily with an unlocked gate. Maria was holding on to me, and we approached my old house from the side. I moved along the side to view the front door. I looked up at it, and it appeared closed and locked. We moved then to the back door, which was broken and obviously forced. There were no lights on in the house, but the moon was up and nearly full. A street lamp in front of the house was lit. We need the police, Maria said. I stepped away from the house and called 911, reporting a breaking and entering. I gave the address. Possible hostage situation. I hung up. You stay here. I may have to fight and I can't worry about you. If you think there are more than one, just run away. Okay? I said. She looked at me and nodded. She knew I couldn't worry about the kids, Karen and her. I went to the kitchen door, pushed it, and it swung open until I heard a slight crunch of glass, but open enough to let me in. I stepped as far as I could and mostly missed the glass. I stopped and listened. I heard muffled crying from the living room. It was Hanley, or maybe Dylan. I moved slowly, with careful steps, to the doorway that would give me a view. I looked slowly around the door jamb. The light was dim, from street lamps outside mostly, shining through the door windows, but enough to see shapes and perhaps more since the drapes were open some inches in the middle. There was Karen and, taped up and with duct tape over her mouth, wound around her head several times. Her hands were behind her. She was diagonally across the room from me, sitting on an overstuffed chair by the window. I looked left and saw Hanley tied on the couch, across the room from her mother, and just in sight beyond was Dylan, also on the couch. Then I stared at the guy looking out the front window. I moved into the open. Karen and was looking right at me, but it was hard to make people out in the dark. The guy at the window looked down at her. He said, "Buck should be here by now, shouldn't he?" His accent was heavy. Speaking to himself, or Karen Ann. The house was small. The only sounds were coming from the living room, and the guy did not act like he was working with others. I was fairly certain he was alone. Karen Ann made sounds, but the gag was not letting her speak, or she wanted him to think it. He turned back to the window. I thought he had a gun in his right hand, next to Karen Ann's head, although it was just dangling. His left hand held the drape back so he could see out the side of the window. I couldn't make a move to him without endangering her, not from this angle. I was 13 or so feet from him, and there was a coffee table in the way. But there was another doorway on the other side of the couch, next to where Dylan lay. I quietly went back through the kitchen to the other doorway. I signaled Maria, still on the step outside the kitchen door, that there was one guy. She nodded. I looked around the other jam. There was Karen Ann again. The guy was looking out the window. I was close enough to Dylan to grab him. Still, the pistol was in the guy's right hand pointing down near Karen Ann's head. His back was mostly toward me. Did he have a vest? A packed suicide vest would kill us all if it went off. I saw no evidence of one, just a cotton jacket, and his hands were in sight and no obvious trigger. As he looked again outside, I heard sirens in the distance. He was really concentrating now, 8 or 10 feet away from me looking hard. When it became obvious the police were coming here, he might start shooting. I took a breath and moved. I took 3 steps running and hit him as hard as I could with my right shoulder, my right arm around him to keep him from raising that pistol. I was remembering a football coach saying, "All you think is crush." I yelled it as I hit him, "Crush." We both went through the window in a welter of drape and glass and old, double-hung, casement wood. We were on the porch and he was under me. I didn't want the guy to get up, so I was pounding on him and I thought I knocked his pistol away. I was furious, and it took him a few seconds to get his bearings, but he was scrabbling with me. He was bigger, stronger, and my right, natural hand had nothing to it. He was solid. He rolled us to our sides. The porch light came on. I flailed at him, using my left and right hands, knocking his head into the painted wood porch floor once or twice, yelling and angry, but my right hand was limp and powerless, and I knew when he regained his composure he would win this fight. I was becoming desperate, my mind a jumble of hope for the police or God or something. He was pushing on my chin, bending my head back and painfully so. Then Maria was there with the pistol in her hands. She fell to her knees on the broken glass behind his head. I heard her gasp at the pain. She pointed the gun at the ceiling with both hands and bang! Fired a round into the porch roof, the sound rending the night. We stopped at it. I felt him hesitate, and there was silence but for sirens a few hundred yards away. Then she jabbed the muzzle hard against the crown of his head and said, loudly, forcefully, almost yelling, "Mister, if you move I will shoot you cold as any stone." He moved a bit from a deep breath right then, so she jabbed his head hard with the barrel and declared, "Don't you mess with me." All the wind went out of his sail. My left hand was on the side of his head, pushing it into the wood floor. He stopped struggling and sank into the wood. He was conscious but stunned. Blood streamed from his head where I had banged it. He looked defeated, but I didn't care for appearances. I struggled away from him with my left hand, pushing the side of his head into the floor, hastened up onto my knees next to Maria, and felt the same sharp pain she must have felt of knees on broken glass. Some of my weight was on his head through my left hand, next to the weapon. "Maria, I'll take the pistol." I tried to sound calm, matter of fact, in control. She transferred it to me without looking anywhere but at the assailant, keeping the muzzle against his head with some force. I kept it against the guy using my left hand then, my right weakly supporting, and I would have pulled that trigger if he'd twitched a muscle. Maria stood and went into the house just as the police pulled up. "Help, officers. Help me, please," I said, calling out. They came with guns drawn and ordered me to drop the weapon. They were a man and a woman. "Not where he might get it," I said loudly. I put it down and flung it away along the floor. I raised my hands. I hurt. I was cut and bruised, but we were all alive. Maria and Karen came out, each carrying a kid. Maria with Hanley and Karen with Dylan as more police cars pulled up and officers came charging. Karen had tape hanging from her hair. Dylan and Hanley had tape hanging from their hair also. Karen was saying it was the guy on the floor they should arrest. The one officer recognized me, and finally I was able to lower my hands. Karen and Maria were around me with the kids, then, and my arms were about them. "You okay?" I asked Maria. She leaned into me. I felt her nod. Karen, to my right, spoke rapidly with excitement and relief. "I thought he was going to kill us. I couldn't think of a way to tell you." She was against me and had tears down her face, but she was not debilitated. Her eyes were open and clear with determination to protect her children and herself. "You did. You told me to be careful." She looked at me with her head cocked. She didn't remember saying it. I hugged Hanley then, too, clutched in Maria's arms and Dylan, but I wouldn't let Maria go. She was shaking, and I thought she might be crying, but she wasn't. "Quite a night," I said quietly to her hair. She said, "I didn't want to face the world without you." "You saved our lives," I said. I felt her nod. I didn't want to move. "I'm not sick anymore." "No, you aren't." She paused as police were moving the prisoner about, cuffed. "I think I'll be a good mom." I took a breath and squeezed her, knowing she had beaten back her demon a little more. She probably smiled, but her face was against my chest so I couldn't tell. For a week, I worried Maria would miscarry from the excitement and stress of the hostage affair. She didn't. It was 3 weeks after that my cell phone rang. I saw the number and dread swept through me. I forced myself to answer. Maria was with me and heard my side of the conversation. "John, this is Karen Ann." "Yes, Karen? I'd like to invite you and Maria over for dinner. With the kids, although I'd rather they be napping. There is something I'd like to talk over with you." "Karen Ann, I don't," I said. She was insistent. "I need to say thank you again, and I have a problem. I'd really like to speak with you. Both of you. I don't want to see your parents. You understand that?" "Never," I emphasized. "Of course. Just me and the kids." "Okay." I put the phone down. Maria sat across from me at the kitchen table. "Why," she asked, "are you so angry at her parents?" I thought about it for a moment. I'd been acting on instinct, just knowing I didn't want them in my life. It came to me after I thought about the hope and dreams I'd had for Karen and at the inception of our life together. I'd seen her parents as help, support. I think it's because they gave her away at the wedding. To me, it became my job to provide for her, my job to protect her. It was their role to defend our marriage as long as I was faithful to it. Maria nodded. "It's sad. The whole thing." The next Sunday around 2, we knocked at the door of the old home. The window had been repaired. I wondered if it was covered under homeowner's insurance. Karen greeted us, shook Maria's hand, and had us go straight to the table. "The children were napping," she said. "We ate lasagna and drank coffee." Maria refused, telling Karen that she was 2 months along and avoiding caffeine, receiving congratulations and a glass of water. "That's good news," Karen said. She sounded sincere, but I'd heard her say, "I do" once, and that had sounded sincere also. She said, "You knew you were pregnant when?" "Yeah, that same day the terror was here," Maria said. Karen nodded slightly and took a breath. "John, Maria, my mom is not in good health. My dad is okay, but you know, John, that he is not the warm kind. My parents have been my safety net since our divorce, but mom is probably not going to be able to take care of kids if I were incapable. That's what I want to ask you." I looked at Maria, looking for a clue as to her feelings. She was looking at Karen eyes bright. That's a very scary look for any husband to see in his wife. She knew how I felt about Karen I wondered how Maria would feel after this talk. "You're worried about the kids if you were sick or died or something?" I asked. She was nodding. "My parents understand why you don't want to see them, John, and they agree it's for good reason." She was upset and needed a moment. "But they suggested you." She stood up, went to the refrigerator and picked up a sealed envelope from on top. "They asked me to give this to you. They hope you'll read it. It's for both of you. I know you've never met them, Maria. Maybe, someday." She slid it across the table to Maria. "Later," she said. She sat again. "Is this just foresight, Or is there a reason that something is likely to happen? I wanted to know if she was sick. I need to go to a program, she started to say, staring at the wall. She stopped and looked right at us. I need to go to rehab. I've been drinking and I have to go. My principal gave me an ultimatum. My job is on the line. I'm overwhelmed and I can't stop. I can't leave the kids with mom anymore. Not for more than a day. Anyway, after the hostage thing, I decided if anything happened to me, I'd want you to have the kids. You and Maria, both. I would be grateful if you'd agree. I know after what I did. She just shook her head and said no more. Maria said, "You're asking us to watch your kids while you're in rehab? And then you want to name us as your kids' guardians if anything happens to you?" "Yes, I believe in you. Both of you. I saw you tear through that room, Maria, and you saved us. And the way you held Hanley after you cut the cords. Please consider it." I said the first thing I thought, if it ever happened, I'd never take them to their grandparents. Maria looked at me, and for the first time in our relationship, I thought she was disappointed. Maria said to Karen, "And your parents live in town, right?" "Yes," Karen said, "not far." Maria was making plans already, plans to get around me. She'd get the kids to their grandparents if I wouldn't. She knew I'd not stop loving her for doing something she thought was good. Even I thought it was good, I just wouldn't do it. I realized she wasn't scared of Karen and with me. She wasn't scared of the love I felt for Hanley and Dylan. She was secure in my love for her. I had that most terrifying of wives, an equal. Taking a deep breath, Karen said, "If they're ever orphaned, I'm asking you to raise them as your best judgment guides you. All of their inheritance would be in your control. Right now I'm asking you to take care of them for a few months while I get straightened out. My parents aren't part of this. It's my choice, and if you don't want to visit my parents, then don't." Maria looked at me. "They're kids, John. You could have a closer relationship with them." She knew my soul and my mind before I did. I hated that. I kept my expression dour, serious. Karen spoke quietly. "I have nowhere else to go. There is no one else in my life. I'm not asking you to adopt them. If the worst comes to the worst, that would be up to you. I know some good parents at work, but I want my kids to be good. Not like their father. Not like me. Good. You two are my first choice, but also the only ones I'd choose. Both of you. If not you, it would just be the luck of the draw." She looked from the one to the other of us as she spoke. She was changed. She had been profligate and now was alcoholic, admittedly. From what she said, her dating life was almost non-existent for all the responsibility of raising the two kids, keeping the house, and working. Perhaps because of all that, she had developed one virtue. She loved her kids. Perhaps it would lead to others. She was confident that one thing about me would never change. I'd rather roll a ball on the floor with a toddler than do just about anything else. I'd never turn my back on a kid in need. Karen was trying to salvage her life. How much strength, how much desperation did it take to admit her mistakes toward me? She implored us. I had been helped by 2 priests, a doctor, a lawyer, a class of people in Cleveland. I'd been emotionally thanked by a grateful husband and father, a high school writer, cops, hostages. Perhaps it would not be easy. I smiled to myself, looking at my hand in Maria's, remembering a guy who taught philosophy but did not wear socks. What do I deserve? I looked right at Karen. I was silent for a moment and then asked, "How long for the rehab?" 2 months maybe, but it's case by case, so... Summer. She shrugged, embarrassed but heartened. She knew I was considering. I saw the determination in her, the concentration on what I said. She was worried about her children and only her children. She was listening for one thing. Would we do it or not? I said, "We will never be close, Karen, and you and I'm not your friend. Some things are forever. And the things you did were unforgettable if not unforgivable." I hesitated, thinking about what I should say. I shook my head as she nodded hers. It would always have an awkwardness, and perhaps the kids would see it. Maybe she'd find a guy, and all this preparation would recede into the background of our lives. I felt the little woman on my left, felt her confidence in me. She knew me and loved me. Byron was right. The greatest joy was knowing you were loved. It would be frightful not to live. Maybe I could be worthy of it. I saw the hope in Karen Ann's eyes when I stopped talking. She had not heard no. I turned to my wife. "We should talk." Maria looked at me, squeezed my left hand with her little ones, and smiled. "Yes, we should." Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.